On a freezing night, a husband's anger turned cruel. He stopped the car, ordered his wife out, and drove away, leaving her alone on a desolate, snow-choked road. With no signal, no help, and only a dying phone, Claire Bennett began walking through the dark, fighting cold and fear with each fragile step. But survival led her to an unexpected door, and the moment she decided not to stay silent anymore. By morning, police lights cut through the pines, and the man who tried to leave her behind faced the truth she refused to bury. What happens when quiet endurance turns into quiet power? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The windshield fog and slow white breaths that vanished just as quickly as they came. Claire Bennett sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the wipers smear thin ice back and forth across the glass. Beyond the headlights, the road stretched empty and pale, the snow falling in long, silent threads. The dinner had been meant to break the monotony. A small attempt at kindness, she told herself, a way to thaw the distance that had grown through years of unspoken slights and careful walking around his temper. But now, an hour later, the darkness outside the car felt heavier than it should, and Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make the leather creak. "You missed a turn," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't sharp, just even, trying to avoid that tone that always seemed to set him off. "It's another 5 miles to the highway now." Mark's laugh was short and brittle. "Don't start with me, Claire. I know where I'm going." He glanced sideways, eyes glinting under the dash lights, then back to the snowy road. "You always think you know better. Always." She kept her gaze forward, watching the endless white blur through the beams. "It's just," there was a sign. "You didn't see it." He let out a sharp breath, the kind that was more warning than sigh. "Because maybe I don't need your directions every time we go somewhere. Maybe I just want to drive." Claire bit the inside of her cheek and stayed quiet, the seat belt tight across her chest. She learned long ago that his anger could flare fast, small things tipping it like a match near dry kindling. And yet something about tonight, the long silence at dinner, the way he checked his phone and barely looked up, made her less willing to fold herself small. "You're lost," she said softly, but the softness didn't make it safer. It landed anyway. The tires hummed over the snow and his hands tightened. "Lost." His laugh came again, louder this time, scraping the edges of control. "You think I'm lost?" "I think it's easy to turn around and go back to the highway," she answered, still quiet, but no longer afraid of her own words. "I think we're heading deeper into nothing." The silence that followed was worse than the yelling, the kind where every second swells until it fills the car. He didn't answer. The headlights cut a thin tunnel through the falling white, and she could hear her heart now, slow but strong. Part of her wanted to reach out, to defuse, to apologize for something that wasn't wrong. Another part was too tired. Mark finally spoke, voice low and dangerous. "You know what, Claire?" The car slowed. "Maybe you should get out if you know everything." Her head snapped toward him, but he didn't look at her. The engine dropped to a growl as he braked hard, tires crunching over the crusted snow at the shoulder. The world outside the glass was nothing but woods and cold and silence. She felt the air change, the same way storms announce themselves just before they break. "Mark," she said, but her voice was barely sound. He was already leaning across her, unbuckling the seatbelt, motion sharp and final. The dome light flicked on when he opened the passenger door, casting a weak yellow glow over the drifting flakes. Cold air rushed in, biting her face. "Out," he said, each letter cut clean. "You know the way, don't you?" Claire sat frozen for a heartbeat, then another. She thought of the miles of dark road behind them, of the phone in her coat pocket, almost dead, of the soundless woods. She met his eyes and found nothing but flat fury there. She stepped out into the night. The door shut, a hollow clap swallowed by snow. For a second she stood there, breath white in the headlights, watching the taillights flare red, then fade to pinpoints and vanish down the road. The silence after the engine was gone was so complete she could hear her own pulse. She wrapped her coat tighter, turned her back to the vanished car, and started walking into the white. The tires crunched over hard-packed ice as Mark jerked the wheel to the right, bringing the car to a sudden, bone-deep stop. The seatbelt cut against Claire's collarbone, forcing a gasp from her before she could brace herself. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the idling engine and the rasp of the heater. Then Mark's voice, rough and too loud for the small space. "Enough," he snapped, hands still locked on the wheel. "I've had enough of your constant corrections, Claire. Enough of you thinking you know better." She blinked at him, heart slamming against her ribs. Her breath fogged the glass and came back damp on her face. "I wasn't correcting. Always you miss a sign. You're lost. Turn back." "I'm sick of it." He struck the steering wheel once with the heel of his hand. The sharp, hollow thud filled the car and made her flinch before she could stop herself. "Mark," she said quietly, but it was like throwing a pebble into a storm. He shoved the shifter into park and twisted toward her, his face caught between the cold blue of the dashboard and the weak orange glow of the map light above. "You want out? Get out." "I didn't say that." Her voice came out thin, brittle, but steady enough. "You don't have to. Everything you say means it." His breath was quick now, fogging up the inside of the windshield. "Go on. Walk back to your perfect highway since you know everything." The latch clattered under his hand as he leaned across her and yanked the door handle. Cold air surged in, filling the cabin with the smell of ice and pine. The door swung wide, spilling light into the dark. Snow swirled immediately, dusting the seat and her coat sleeve. "Stop," she whispered, but he didn't. "Out," he said again, sharper this time, and gave the door a hard shove so it opened all the way. His shoulder brushed hers, sudden and forceful. Claire's stomach hollowed out. She looked at him for a long moment. The tense jaw, the eyes that wouldn't quite meet hers now, staring past her into the dark like what he was doing required distance. The wind found the open space and swept through. Flakes stung her cheeks and melted along her neck. She could smell the engine heat and something metallic she couldn't name. Slowly, without looking away, she slid one boot to the edge of the pavement and stepped out. The crunch of snow underfoot sounded impossibly loud. Her second step followed, unsteady but sure enough to clear the door. He leaned past her once more, fast and final, and slammed it shut. The sound cracked like a gunshot and left ringing silence behind. The car's dome light blinked out, leaving only the twin red eyes of the taillights. For one suspended second, the exhaust curled in slow ghost behind the bumper, warm against the freezing night. Then the tires caught, and the car lurched forward. No pause, no last glance back, just the receding roar of the engine swallowed by wind. She stood in the dim cone of fading light. Coat pulled tight, breath coming too fast and clouding around her. The taillights slipped further and further down the road, shrinking until they vanished into the white swirl. When the silence settled back over her, it was so complete she could hear the slow pound of her own heartbeat in her ears. She turned once, a full circle, to see nothing but trees and sky and the narrow cut of road disappearing into blackness both ways. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she pulled her coat tighter at the neck, tucked her hands inside her sleeves, and took her first small step into the dark. The snow took her footprints soundlessly, and the night closed in behind. The cold pressed in from every side as though the night itself were alive and reaching for her. Claire stood on the narrow shoulder where the car had been only minutes before, the twin ruts of Mark's tires already softening beneath drifting flakes. Her boots sank half an inch with every shift of weight, the snow not deep yet but unsteady, loose and shifting as it gathered in low, patient mounds. She tried to swallow, but her throat felt dry despite the damp air. Her breath came ragged and uneven, white plumes rushing upward and dissolving into the dark. For a long while she didn't move. The instinct to stay still held her, as if being perfectly quiet might somehow undo what just happened, as if he might return, headlights cutting to the white, window rolling down in reluctant apology. But the only light was a faint silver cast from a hidden moon, and the only sound was the soft hiss of falling snow meeting the road. Then, faint and far away, a whisper of tires. She turned toward it with a flicker of hope, but the sound passed somewhere beyond the trees, on a different road, belonging to strangers she couldn't see. She raised her hand anyway, ridiculous in the dark, as if they could somehow know and stop. The noise faded back into the great silence until she couldn't be sure she'd heard anything at all. She shifted her weight again, snow crunching softly, and realized how quickly the cold was biting through her coat. It wasn't thin, but not built for this. An ordinary wool coat for short walks from car to door, not for standing alone on an unlit highway shoulder in December wind. She shoved her gloved hands deeper into her pockets and turned in the direction she thought town might be. It wasn't really clear. The landmarks were gone under night and flurries. But standing still wasn't an option. She needed warmth, light, something that meant safety. Her boots squeaked faintly with each step, and soon that was the only sound she could hear besides a restless air moving through bare trees. The sky was low and colorless, making no distinction between road and forest, and the beam from her phone, when she risked pulling it out, was weak and dying. The battery icon glowed red and accusing before she switched it off again, saving what little power remained in case she found service. Her fingers trembled as she slid it back into her pocket. Snowflakes caught in her eyelashes and melted against her skin, wet and cold. She brushed them away, breathing carefully so she wouldn't lose more warmth to the open air. She thought of the diner they'd passed maybe 10 miles back and tried to picture a map, the curves of Route 6 feeding into this back road, but nothing felt certain anymore. The landscape here was too still, too stripped of signs. Her mind wanted to replay the scene, the snap in his voice, the push of the door, but she forced it quiet. Survival first. Move forward one slow step at a time. Feet on the road. Breath controlled. Don't waste time arguing with what's done. Once, behind her somewhere in the trees, something cracked. A branch. She told herself, only a branch shedding its ice. Still, she quickened her pace, boots sinking and squealing softly with each push forward. Her pulse thudded in her ears, loud enough to feel like company. Minutes slid by without meaning. The night wrapped itself around her like thick cloth, hiding distance and time. Sometimes she looked back and saw only her own footprints filling with powder, vanishing almost as soon as she made them. She imagined the road itself erasing her, the storm covering every trace. A gust of wind barreled down the empty stretch, shoving at her side, making her stumble and throw a hand out to balance. The cold bit the skin exposed above her scarf and burned her lungs when she inhaled too quickly. She paused, steadied, and went on. The wind rose and felt like an invisible ocean. Between gusts came profound stillness, the kind that felt like the whole world holding its breath. In that silence, she found herself listening, not for cars, but for anything human. A door slam, a dog, music somewhere far away. Nothing, just a pulse in her head and the soft pad of her boots. It struck her that she had never felt so alone, not even in the arguments, not even in the empty house before tonight. Here there was no one to talk over her, no one to watch her falter, just the white road and the dark beyond. She pulled her coat tighter and leaned forward into the next stretch, her body remembering movement even as her mind faltered. Each step sent a small protest up her calves, but she kept going, because stopping wasn't an option, and because some small, stubborn part of her believed there had to be something ahead, a sign, a light, a place that wasn't this. Her hands had gone so numb she barely felt the zipper slide as she reached into her coat pocket. The phone was there, small and smooth and suddenly fragile against her palm. She pressed the side button, and a weak glow spilled across her face, startling against the dark. 3%. The number stared back at her, like a countdown. She shielded the screen with her hand, turned in a slow circle, hoping to see even the faintest flicker of service bars. Nothing, just a mocking word, no signal where hope should be. She lifted the phone higher, absurdly, as if a few inches could coax life out of the sky. For a moment, one thin bar flickered into existence, a whisper of possibility. Her thumb moved before she thought, tapping out a message with clumsy fingers that felt too thick for the screen. Asterisk car broke down. Alone. Highway. Snow. Please. Asterisk. She hesitated over who to send it to. Her sister's name hovered there. So did the number for emergency services. She knew might not connect without signal. She hit send anyway. The bar disappeared the instant she pressed her thumb down. The message hung gray and unsent. She tried once more, thumb trembling, but the phone thought for a long time and then returned the same blank refusal. Her chest tightened. Not panic, not yet, but the first taste of it, metallic and dry. She stared at the screen, willing it to change, willing another flicker of connection. It stayed stubbornly empty. A gust of wind slapped across her face and carried stinging flecks of ice into her eyes. She blinked hard, tucked the phone back into her coat, and zipped the pocket closed. She couldn't afford to drain the batteries staring at a blank signal. That tiny remaining charge might matter later. When the screen went black, the night seemed to swell closer, as if the light had been holding something back. For a heartbeat, she considered staying put. Maybe Mark would circle back. Maybe someone would drive past. But the road had been empty except for that one whisper of distant tires long ago. She couldn't stand here until the cold hollowed her out. Moving was all she had. She adjusted her scarf, pulled it higher over her chin, and started forward again, boots breaking small paths in the snow. Her shoulders hunched against the wind, and she kept her eyes low to avoid the stinging flakes. Each step seemed to echo, though there was nothing to echo off but the dark. The phone's weight was a small, cold comfort against her hip, a connection to the world that wasn't working but still there, still possible. As she walked, she caught herself imagining tiny bursts of light through the trees, headlights maybe, a porch somewhere, a house tucked away. But every glow was just a trick of her eyes, moonlight bending through branches, ice catching what little sky there was. Each time she lifted her head, hope rose and fell just as fast. She tried to think of warm things, the diner coffee earlier that night, the sound of her niece's laughter on the phone last week, even the clatter of the old heater at home. Anything to push back the quiet that pressed in harder with each step. But memory only made the present sharper. This road was still empty, this cold still real. After a while she tried humming softly, a song she couldn't place. Maybe something from childhood, maybe just noise to keep her company. The sound wavered and died against the vast stillness. It felt strange to hear her own voice, so small out here. Her legs ached, calves burning where the boots rubbed. She counted paces for a while, 50, then another 50, just to give herself a rhythm, a reason to keep going. Each count felt like proof she was still here, still moving, still alive. And under it all, that thin thread of determination held. Keep walking until something changes. Keep the phone safe. Keep your head down. Keep moving. Somewhere out here was a road with lights, a house with warmth, or at least a way back to the world that had left her behind. She refused to believe it could all just be snow and silence forever. So Claire Bennett leaned into wind and kept going, her breath white and ragged, her steps careful but sure, the dead phone tucked close like a secret she wasn't ready to give up on. The daylight drained away so quietly that at first she didn't notice. It was just a subtle thinning, the edges of the road blurring, until white and gray became the same color, until the woods on either side folded into a deeper shade. Her boots left small, neat impressions behind her, but even as she made them, the wind worked to erase each one. She glanced back once and was startled to see how little of her own passage remained. Only a few faint prints before the path behind turned to blank snow again. Her breath felt heavier now, slower, catching in her chest before it could escape. She tugged her scarf higher to cover her mouth and nose, but the wool was damp from melted flakes and warm air. The wind came in small, sudden gusts that made her stagger, and she adjusted her balance like a sailor finding footing on a restless deck. Her hands had gone almost numb inside her pockets, the fingertips tingling in warning. She told herself she could keep going until full dark, but full dark was coming faster than she expected. Up ahead the road narrowed, the shoulder disappearing into a thin icy edge, no more than a ribbon of black between walls of pine. Branches hung low, heavy with snow, and the air smelled of resin and cold. Somewhere in the distance a crow gave a single croak, sharp and startling. Then the woods went back to silence. She kept walking, boots scuffing softly, careful to stay near the middle where the ice looked less slick. Then faint and sudden light, far behind her, a glow, low and yellow against the oncoming dusk. Her pulse jumped before she turned. Headlights, real ones, bobbing through the trees. They were still far, but she could see the reflection in the thin mist of snow swirling along the road surface. For the first time since Mark's taillights vanished, her chest filled with something like relief. She stepped to the edge, heart hammering, already lifting one arm. The lights grew larger, sweeping toward her. She waved, the motion awkward in her heavy coat, but high and deliberate. "Hey!" she shouted, voice breaking the silence. Her throat ached from dryness, but she tried again, louder, both arms now slicing the air. "Stop, please." For a second she thought it might work. The beam seemed to slow, angle shifting, maybe the driver seeing her. She waved harder, half running a step closer to the center of the road. The sound of tires hissed louder on ice. Then just as suddenly, the car veered slightly, sliding wide as if to avoid her, and roared past. She saw only a blur, silver, maybe gray. The profile of the driver's face turned briefly her way and then gone. Cold wind slammed against her as the vehicle swept by. Its red taillights flared and vanished around a bend without slowing once. She stood there shaking, her breath clouding fast, chest pulled tight. The echo of its passing lingered, a fading shush of tires, then nothing but the slow closing hush of falling snow. She lowered her arms and felt the burn where hope had risen, and then crashed down just as quickly. Whoever it was had seen her and chosen not to stop. For a long moment she didn't move. She felt foolish and exposed, standing in the middle of the road like a lost signal flare. Her legs trembled, but it wasn't just from cold. It was a sudden, heavy weight of being unseen even when plainly visible. Finally, she turned back toward the direction she'd been heading, forcing herself forward though her knees felt weak. Her eyes stung. From the wind, she told herself, only from the wind, but the world blurred for a few paces until she blinked hard and cleared it. The snow was coming faster now, small dry flakes that didn't melt when they touched her cheeks. She pressed on, watching the light fade from the sky until even the pale ribbon of road ahead grew indistinct. She began counting steps again, not out loud this time, but inside, a quiet mantra to keep panic from creeping in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Keep going. Keep going. The echo of the passing car haunted her. The way help had brushed so close and sped away. But she would not stop. She adjusted the scarf, tucked her chin, and pushed on into the deepening gray, each footstep fragile but determined against the wide, swallowing dark. The cold had stopped feeling sharp and had begun to seep instead. A quiet invasion she couldn't fight by pulling her coat tighter. The wool that had seemed solid hours ago was wet and heavy now. Every thread storing the snow that had melted against her body and then frozen again in the wind. She tried to shake some of it off and felt the chill immediately deepen when the damp cloth shifted. Her hands were stiff enough that the simple act of adjusting the scarf felt clumsy, like she was wearing gloves made of wood. Claire paused in the road, breath a low, ragged fog, and tried to stretch her fingers. They didn't want to obey. They curled weakly and then trembled when she forced them open. The ache had turned dull, almost distant, and she knew that wasn't a good sign. She had once read something about frostbite, about numbness meaning danger, but the thought floated sluggishly through her mind and was gone again before it could take hold. Thinking was harder now. Her steps had slowed without her noticing, and she found herself stopping more often, as if listening to something she couldn't name. The trees had blurred into a single dark wall on either side. She no longer knew how long she had been walking. Somewhere inside that fog of cold and exhaustion, small pieces of memory began surfacing and sliding away like fish in dark water. She saw her daughter, Lila, at 4 years old, standing in the doorway one spring morning with mismatched socks and hair sticking up, laughing because she'd spilled orange juice on herself and didn't care. She heard the bright, bubbling sound of it, the way Lila's whole body seemed to laugh, not just her mouth. The image burned warm and immediate for a moment before it thinned and the cold crept back. Then she saw Mark, but younger, his smile easy, back before word became weapons. They had gone camping once when they were first married, gotten lost on a mountain road. He'd teased her about reading the map upside down and kissed her forehead when they finally found the trail again. She remembered the smell of smoke in his jacket and the way he'd wrapped her up when she shivered. That man felt impossibly far away now, as if he belonged to some other life she dreamed and then misplaced. She stumbled and caught herself, breath catching hard. The thought that she might simply sit down came quietly and felt strangely tempting. Just stop, just rest, just close her eyes for a bit. But another image flashed. Lila again, but older now. The way she looked last week at the breakfast table, ponytail messy, asking if Claire would be back in time for the school concert. Claire had promised she wouldn't miss it. That small memory cut clean to the fog and reached something fierce still alive inside her. She blinked hard, shook her head, and forced her hands to move, rubbing them together for friction though the effort made her arms heavy. She looked down the road. Still no light, no sound except the restless sweep of wind over ice. But she took one step, then another, telling herself with each movement that Lila was waiting. That warmth and life still waited if she could just keep going. The coat sagged around her shoulders, damp and clumsy, but she clutched it close anyway. Her breathing grew louder in her ears, uneven but steady enough to prove she was still fighting. Memories tried to drift back, lulling and heavy, but she focused on the rhythm of her boots instead. Crunch, pause, crunch. Keep moving. Don't let the cold have the last word. Somewhere ahead there had to be light. Somewhere, someone. She pictured it. A porch lamp, a gas station sign, headlights turning a bend. And let that picture be a small fire she could carry as she walked deeper into the dark. It took her a few long, trudging minutes to realize the pale shimmer ahead wasn't just another trick of her eyes. At first it was no more than a vague warmth in the dark, faint and wavering like a candle seen from miles away. She kept walking, head bowed against the wind, and when she looked up again it was still there, a tiny ember tucked between the trees off to the right, barely visible through a scrim of falling snow. She stopped, heart kicking once in her chest, and stared. Not headlights, not the hard white glare of a car. This was softer, golden, and above it a thin, reluctant ribbon of smoke wandered into the sky and was quickly swallowed by the night. She hesitated. The idea of leaving the road felt dangerous. Roads meant direction, meant at least some chance of a passing car. But her body made the decision before her head could finish its argument. She stepped carefully off the blacktop and into the powder, sinking almost to her calves as she pushed through the first drifts toward the faint glow. Each movement sent tiny cold knives into her boots, but the light grew steadier as she drew closer, and the promise of heat and people, or at least shelter, pulled stronger than the fear of being alone in the woods. Branches clutched at her coat and tugged strands of her hair loose from under her hood. She moved slowly, one hand extended for balance, telling herself to keep going just a little farther. The snow muffled everything until she could hear only her own breath and the small crunch of her boots breaking the crust. Then, abruptly, the trees thinned and a clearing opened. It was small, barely enough for the one-room structure that sat crooked on stone piers. The cabin looked old, patched with mismatched boards and roof shingles gone dull with age, but the window glowed with lamplight, golden and steady. Smoke slipped from a narrow tin chimney and curled sideways before vanishing into the trees. The sight stopped her where she stood, sudden and overwhelming. Warmth, shelter, someone alive. She moved forward cautiously, listening, scanning for movement. There was no sound but the wind whispering along the cabin's walls. No sign of life except that beautiful thread of smoke and the lamp's unwavering glow. She tried to call out, but her throat cracked on the first attempt. She swallowed and tried again, voice low and hoarse. "Hello?" The word fell flat and small, swallowed by snow and wood. She waited, heart thudding painfully, but no answer came, only the faint creak of the trees shifting behind her. The silence felt watchful, not unfriendly, but not inviting either. She told herself that didn't matter. If someone was inside, they would decide what to do when she knocked. If not, at least there was a door, walls, a roof to break the wind. She stumbled the last few yards until she reached the rough porch, boards groaning under her weight. Up close, the cabin smelled of old pine and faint with smoke. A small pile of split logs rested by the door. Her numb fingers fumbled for the latch and stopped, uncertain. She raised her fist and knocked. 3 soft raps at first, then louder when nothing stirred. The sound echoed dully inside, and she could hear her own pulse while she waited. From somewhere within came a single low bark, deep and warning, but not furious. Relief almost knocked her to her knees. She whispered, Hey there." Not sure she meant the dog or the person belonged to. After a pause, a shuffle of footsteps answered. A shadow moved across the lighted window. The door creaked, open a cautious hand's width. Warm air, smelling of wood fire and old flannel, rolled over her face like mercy. An older man's lined face appeared, eyes pale and sharp beneath a knitted cap. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the snow caked on her coat, the red in her cheeks, the tremor in her breath. "You lost?" he asked quietly. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She tried again and managed, "My car, he left. I've been walking." The man's gaze softened just enough to read as human. "Come in," he said, pushing the door wider and stepping back. The dog, a broad, gray-muzzled shepherd, stood behind his boots, tail low but no longer bristling. Warmth poured from the doorway, stunning after the hours of ice and silence. She crossed the threshold on shaky legs, one hand brushing the doorframe as if to make sure it was real. The man shut the door behind her with a quiet final click, shutting out the storm, and for the first time since she'd been pushed into the night, Claire felt the faintest edge of safety slide in under the cold. The door swung open wider, just enough for her to step inside, and the first thing that hit her was heat, real heavy, almost dizzying after the hours of wind. It rushed up her sleeves, pressed against her numb face until her skin stung. The scent of wood smoke clung to it, mingled with something faintly metallic, like old tools and winter boots drying by a stove. The man who'd opened the door moved with deliberate care, one hand on the jamb, the other resting loosely near the dog that hovered at his knee. He was tall but slightly stooped, broad in the shoulders in a way that hadn't faded with age. His beard was close-trimmed and gray, his face lined deep but steady. Eyes of pale, thoughtful blue studied her without hurry, scanning her face, the soaked-hem of her coat, the way her hands trembled and clutched at each other. Behind him, the dog, a shepherd mixed with grizzle fur and intelligent eyes, barked once, sharp enough to rattle her already frayed nerves, then fell silent when the man spoke a single low word. "That's enough, Duke." The animal sank back onto its haunches but kept watching her, head tilted, tail brushing once across the worn floor. "Come on," the man said at last, stepping aside. His voice was deep but calm, and though it wasn't warm exactly, there was no edge to it, no threat, just a quiet authority. Claire hesitated on the threshold, her body shaking harder now that warmth was within reach. Her eyes darted around the small single-room cabin, a pot-bellied stove glowing red in the corner, boots lined near the door, a low table scattered with yellowed newspapers, and a wall hooks hung with heavy coats, and an old sheriff's hat gone soft at the edges. Something about that hat made her swallow and finally step forward. The man closed the door behind her with a careful hand, turning the lock with a soft click that somehow didn't feel trapping but safe. He took one look at her and crossed to the stove, dragging a plain wooden chair closer to the fire. "Sit. You're half frozen." Her knees nearly gave way as she obeyed. She lowered herself onto the chair and held her palms out instinctively, though they were so numb the first touch of heat made them throb with painful pins and needles. She winced and sucked in a breath. "Hurts a bit coming back," he said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "Means you're not too far gone." He studied her for another moment, then moved to a shelf and poured steaming water from an old kettle into a chipped mug. The smell of something herbal filled the air as he dropped in a tea bag and brought it over, setting it carefully on the table beside her. "Sip slow," he said. "Hot will shock your stomach if you throw it back." She reached for it with clumsy hands, managing a small whisper of thanks. The man nodded once and crouched to stoke the fire, the glow throwing long lines across his face. "Name's Walt Briggs," he said after a moment, not looking at her but not unfriendly either. "I'm up here most winters. Easier on the knees than town plowing." His gaze flicked toward her again, calm but sharp. "You alone out there?" Her throat closed and open on the truth. "My husband," she managed and stopped. The word felt strange now, thin and dangerous. "He left me." Walt's face didn't change much, but something in his eyes sharpened. He didn't pepper her with questions. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if fitting puzzle pieces together. "Road's bad tonight," he said after a beat. "Not safe to walk." He stood and reached for a heavy quilt from a peg, settling it around her shoulders with a surprising gentleness. "Warm up first, then we'll figure next steps." Duke the dog had moved closer, sitting just within reach, eyes softening as if he decided she was no threat. His quiet presence beside the fire felt like an anchor. Claire clutched the mug and tried to drink, hands shaking so badly she had to brace it with both. Heat spread down her throat, into her chest, loosening something tight there. Tears prickled behind her eyes before she could stop them, but she kept her gaze on the fire and swallowed them back. "You did right, knocking," Walt said finally, settling into a chair opposite hers. "Night like this, folks freeze faster than they think." His voice had the even, unhurried weight of someone who'd spent years talking people through worse. "You're safer now." The words hit harder than she expected. So simple but so needed. Safe. She hadn't let herself think about safety since the door slammed behind her. Her shoulders sagged under the quilt's weight. Her body shaking less now from cold than from everything catching up. Walt didn't push. He sat, quiet and steady, letting the fire crackle between them. The room's warmth thickened, carrying the smell of smoke and pine and the faint scent of the dog's fur. Slowly, almost against her will, her breathing began to match the soft rise and fall of Duke's beside her. For the first time since Mark's car vanished into the storm, she felt anchored to something human and solid. Not whole, not yet, but no longer alone in the dark. Steam rose in soft spirals from the chipped mug as Claire tried to speak. Her hands were steadier now, but still wrapped in the quilt, the edges of it tucked so tightly around her that it felt like armor. Walt sat across from her, elbows on his knees, palms loose and open, the posture of someone used to letting silence do the work. Duke, the old shepherd, had stretched himself by the stove, head on paws, one eye half-cracked, as though he wanted to be sure of her, but was willing to rest. At first the words wouldn't come. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again, the first attempt breaking into a dry, rasping cough. Walt pushed a tin of honey closer and nodded toward the mug. She stirred it in with awkward, trembling fingers, then took a sip and let the heat coat her throat. "My husband," she said finally, and her own voice sounded strange to her ears, thin and uneven, not the voice she used when ordering coffee or talking to Lila about school, but the small, almost frightened voice she used only when something hurt too much. "Mark, we had dinner in town. On the way back, Her gaze flicked to the door as if the wind might blow it open. He got angry, said I was criticizing. Then he told me to get out. Walt didn't move, didn't frown or startle. His face remained calm, but not indifferent. There was a heaviness in his eyes, a quiet understanding that made her chest ache. "Just left you?" His tone wasn't shocked, only clarifying. She nodded once, slammed the door, drove off. A breath shuddered through her as the words formed. I thought maybe he'd turn around. He didn't. Something flickered across Walt's face. Not surprise, not even judgment, but something older, like recognition. He shifted back in his chair and scratched slowly at his beard. "Cold night to pick a fight," he said at last. That plain sentence nearly undid her. It was so simple, so dry, yet it landed with a weight that said he'd seen this before. Maybe not her exact story, but the shape of it, anger that turns cruel, the thin line between safety and danger. "I walked," she said, more steadily now that the dam had cracked. "No service. My phone almost dead. A car went by but didn't stop." She pressed her hands to the mug until the heat seeped deep enough to sting. "I didn't know where I was. Then I saw the light." "Lucky," Walt said quietly. "Not much out this way. Couple hunters' places, mostly empty in winter." He studied her face then, longer this time, eyes pausing to faint red marks along her jaw where the wind had burned the damp streaks where tears had dried. "How long were you out?" She tried to measure, but the hours had blurred. "I don't know. Maybe 2, maybe 3. He gave a single slow nod. Could have gone bad. The words weren't meant to scare, but to confirm the danger already past. "Cold'll take you quiet if you let it." Claire swallowed, throat thick. "I kept thinking of my daughter," she admitted softly. "I couldn't stop. Her face. That she'd be alone if The rest stuck, and she let it hang there, unfinished. Walt looked down at the floorboards, jaw tight for a moment before he spoke. "Good thing you didn't stop." He straightened slightly, the sheriff in him showing in the steadiness of his gaze. "You're here now. Warm. That's what matters." Something in the room shifted then. Not quite trust, but a thread of safety woven between them. Claire felt in the way her breath began to deepen, and how the shaking in her shoulders slowed. She wasn't just recounting anymore. She was understood. Walt leaned back, reached to pour himself coffee from the battered enamel pot on the stove, and gestured with the pot toward her mug. She nodded, and he refilled it halfway, the smell rich and grounding. "You want to call someone?" he asked after a moment, quiet but practical. She hesitated, thumb brushing the mug's rim. "I don't know who," she admitted. "My sister, maybe? The police? I don't know." His head tilted a fraction. "We can figure it. No rush. Warm up first." She looked up then, and met his eyes fully for the first time. There was no pity there, only an old, worn patience, a sadness that didn't belong to her alone. She realized he really had seen this before, in his years with Badge, and maybe that was why he hadn't looked surprised. He'd probably met other women half frozen on roads, other nights when anger turned to cruelty and left someone stranded. The understanding didn't shame her. It steadied her. She wasn't the first, and she wasn't invisible here. She took another sip, the warmth spreading further now, and whispered, "Thank you." Walt's answer was just a slow nod and a quiet, "You're welcome," but it held more weight than the words themselves. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, but inside the air had softened. For the first time since the door slammed behind her on the road, Claire felt like the night might not win. Walt stood slowly, the chair scraping lightly against the plank floor as he pushed it back. The quiet between them had settled into something companionable, but she watched him move with new purpose, crossing to a battered wooden shelf where an old CB radio sat among a tangle of cords and weathered field guides. Its metal edges were dull from years of hands and winters. The mic cord was frayed, but neatly taped in two places. He flipped the switch, and the machine came alive with a dry pop and then a long, low hum. Claire startled at the sound, the sudden burst of static breaking the heavy stillness that had cocooned the cabin. Walt's face, caught in the glow of the stove and the faint green light from the radio, was calm but focused. He adjusted the dial with care, fingers sure despite their size and roughness, until the static thinned enough to suggest voices hiding somewhere beneath it. "County Dispatch, this is Briggs," he said, leaning in toward the mic. His voice deepened, evened out, not unkind but edged with authority. "You out there tonight?" Static filled the air, a restless hiss and pop. For a long half-minute, there was nothing but the sound of wind pushing against the cabin walls and the faint clink of the stove expanding in the heat. Claire held her breath without meaning to. Then, faint but real, a broken answer floated back. "I'd you repeat? Who's calling?" Walt smiled faintly at the sound, small and grim. "Briggs." "Walt, got a stranded party out here, female, mid-30s. Hypothermic, but conscious. Requesting check-in." He glanced at Claire then, giving her the dignity of not describing her fear, only the facts. The voice came back after a burst of static, clearer this time, but still half swallowed by the night. "Copy that, Walt. You're on Ridgeback frequency? Thought you turned that rig in when you retired." A small chuckle left him, the first she'd heard. Kept it tuned for nights like this. A pause, more static, then a different voice, younger maybe, brisk but not unkind. "We got you. Storm's pushing interference, but we're up. Location?" Walt looked at Claire, then turned back to the mic, mile marker unknown. "Off Route 6, Old Hunter's Track near Pike Creek. Cabin's mine. Can guide if needed." Another hiss, then, "Understood. Sit tight, Walt. Might be a while. Roads are icing. You need assistance urgent?" He looked at her again, eyes narrowing just slightly as if measuring. She managed to shake her head. She was cold but steady now, alive, breathing, heat coming back to her cheeks. "Negative urgent," he said, but his voice stayed firm. "She's stable for now. We'll update." The radio crackled again, then the faint, comforting rhythm of low police chatter rose and fell. Codes and numbers, patrol cars calling location checks, the hum of a world she felt cut off from. It wasn't rescue yet, but it was proof the world existed beyond this dark road, proof someone knew they were here. Claire let out a long breath, she hadn't realized she was holding. The sound of voices, even broken and distant, cracked the isolation wide open. "You're talking to them?" she asked, voice small but steadier than before. "Local sheriff still runs night traffic on this frequency." Walt said, sitting back but keeping the radio live, a low, static heartbeat in the corner. "Good to know somebody's awake." She nodded, feeling tears threaten but not fall. "I thought no one—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need her to. "They hear us," Walt said simply. "You're not alone out here anymore." He adjusted the dial once more until the voices sharpened, and the room filled with occasional bursts of dispatch codes, something strangely comforting in its monotony. Claire sat very still, letting the sound wash over her. Each scratch is static proof that connection was possible, that help had come, that the long night might not end with her fading into the snow. The dog shifted and laid its head across her boots, heavy and warm. Walt poured more coffee without asking and set it near her elbow. Then he leaned back, chair tilted just enough to show ease, and kept one ear on the radio. Outside, the storm still moved across the woods, but now the night wasn't a sealed box. Somewhere out there, people knew her name. Somewhere, someone was coming. When the voices on the radio settled back into their steady rhythm of codes and locations, Walt let the mic rest and turned his attention to a wide, yellowed map tacked to the wall behind the stove. The paper was creased and curling at the edges, pocked with tiny thumbtack holes from years of adjustments. Black pen marks and faint pencil notes wove across its surface. Shortcuts only locals would know, hunting tracks, old service roads. He stepped over and ran a hand across one curling edge to smooth it flat, then glanced back at her. "Show me where he left you," he said quietly. Claire hesitated, mug warm in her hands, then stood and moved closer. Her legs felt heavy but stronger than before. The quilt slid from her shoulders, and Duke lifted his head to watch but didn't rise. "We ate at Miller's Diner," she said, voice steadier now but still hushed, as though the map might be listening. "Just past town on the main road." She traced a shaking finger over the dark line of Route 6 until she found the little that marked Miller's, penciled in a faint hand. Walt nodded once, slow and deliberate. "That's a good 30 miles behind us." She swallowed. He missed the turn for the highway. "I told him." We kept going, and then, "I don't know." He pulled off somewhere out here. "Show me how long after the diner," Walt said. She thought, eyes narrowing in concentration. "Maybe 40 minutes? We weren't going fast." He was talking less and less. Walt's mouth tightened, just a flicker. He reached for a stub of pencil resting on a windowsill and made a small mark on the road that ran north from the diner before branching into unlit spurs. "You see anything?" he asked. "Signs, Barnes gas station?" "Just trees. One old billboard, I think. Something about fishing cabins." His eyes moved quick and exact along the spidery roads. "That'd be this cutoff here," he muttered, half to himself. "Pike Creek Road. Not much else between there and the ridge." He made another mark, then turned back to her. "How long you walked before you saw the light?" 2 hours, maybe 3. He made a small, thoughtful sound and drew a dotted line along one side road to his cabin's clearing, ending with a neat X where they stood now. His handwriting was quick but controlled, every movement efficient. Claire watched him work and felt, for the first time all night, like she was tethered to something rational and deliberate. Each mark on the paper turned her aimless, wandering into a traceable path, proof she hadn't simply vanished into the snow. He stepped back and studied the map with a narrowed gaze, thumb rubbing at his beard. "He didn't just drop you," he said finally. "He took you out past where folks drive at night. Knew what he was doing." The words hit with quiet force. She wanted to argue, to soften them, but couldn't. She had felt it. The way the road had changed, how dark and empty it became before he stopped. She nodded slowly instead. Walt looked at her, expression not pitying but firm. "Means he didn't expect you to get far. Didn't count on you keeping your head." A shaky exhale escaped her. "I almost didn't." "But you did," he said simply. Then, with a kind of finality, he added, "Now we know where we're working from." He returned the pencil to the sill, looked at the radio, then back at her. "They'll need a clear spot to reach us. You can tell what you told me, but this helps." He tapped the map, once with his knuckle, the sound crisp in the warm room. Claire stared at the dotted line she had unknowingly walked, the lonely miles between the excess. Something about seeing it drawn, not just in her memory but on paper, steadied her heartbeat. It turned fear into a geography she could understand. Walt glanced at her one more time, eyes sharp but gentle around the edges. "You remember what hour you left the diner?" She thought back to the coffee check, the neon clock on the wall. The way Mark's phone had buzzed and gone unanswered. 9:15, she said. "Close to that." He wrote it neatly by the first mark. "Then we know your window." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire snapped softly. Duke snored once and shifted closer to the heat. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin, but inside it felt solid, mapped, understood. Claire realized her breathing had slowed. Not because the danger was gone, she could still feel its edges, but because here, in the small circle of light, someone was looking directly at it with her and making it less impossible to face. Walt studied the map one last time, then glanced over. "You did good coming this way," he said, quiet but firm. "Smart feet." The compliment, spare and practical as it was, landed heavy and warm. She felt a sudden, surprising sting of tears, but blinked them back and nodded. For the first time since the door had slammed, she felt like the night could be measured, named, and eventually left behind. Walt didn't say much after marking the map. He gave it one last glance, then moved with quiet purpose toward a row of hooks near the door. From them he pulled down a heavy parka, its canvas shoulders faded and frayed, and slid it on with the slow economy of someone long practiced in winter work. The sight of him preparing for the cold made Claire's stomach tighten. Going back outside felt unthinkable after the fragile safety of heat and light. But something in his calm steadied her too. "We'll take a look," he said, voice low but decisive. "Tracks won't hold forever in this weather." She hesitated, glancing at the dark window where snow whispered against the glass. "It's safe?" "Safer with me and Duke than alone." He bent to tug on thick boots, the laces stiff but sure under his hands. "You don't have to come far. Just far enough to show me where you think you started." She nodded without trusting her voice and found herself standing, the quilt slipping to the floor. Walt took an oil lantern from a shelf and checked the wick with the same slow care he'd shown the radio. The soft flare of flame when he lit it made the room glow honey-warm for an instant before he turned the knob to dim the light to a steady amber. Duke was already on his feet, tail giving a single thump as if to say he understood the plan. The door groaned against the cold when Walt opened it. A gust swept in, bringing the smell of pine and sharp ice, but the lantern's glow pushed back just enough to show the porch and the trees beyond. Claire braced herself and stepped out after him. The night was blacker than she remembered, and the stars above seemed brutal in their clarity, scattered and cold. Snow drifted lightly now instead of the heavy sheets from earlier, tiny white sparks tumbling in the lantern light. Walt took the first steps down off the porch, his boots crunching softly. Duke leapt past him, nose low, tail swishing in arcs that cut through powder. Claire followed close behind, grateful for the lantern's pool of light and the big man's steady pace. They moved through a screen of thin pines into a rough track that passed for a driveway open onto the main road, really more of a buried lane, its blacktop hidden under a quilt of white. Walt lifted the lantern high and studied the surface. "There," he said quietly. At first she saw nothing but blank snow, but when he moved closer and tilted the light, she caught it. Faint twin grooves just visible under the fresh dusting, the suggestion of tread patterns pressed hours ago. They curved from the lane into the darkness beyond, ghost lines against the untouched surface. "That him?" Walt asked. She swallowed, heart stuttering. "Yes." Duke padded forward, nose to the tracks, tail now straight and alert. He sniffed carefully, moving along the line with a seriousness that felt almost human. Walt crouched, glove brushing the snow beside the marks. "Left a while back, but not long enough for the road to cover it all," he murmured. "Wind's changing, though." He glanced back at her. "Good we came now." She stared at the tracks, those shallow indentations proof of both cruelty and survival. That was where she had stood, right there, when the taillights vanished. A wave of cold memory passed through her sharper than the air itself. Walt seemed to sense it because he rose slowly and moved closer, lantern held between them like a small shield. "You're not there now," he said simply. She nodded once, grateful for clarity of that truth. He turned toward the darkness, peering down the road. "Sheriff will want to know where the car went. This helps." He took a slow step into the ruts, walking a short distance just to see how far they stayed visible. Duke trotted after him, nose sweeping side to side, then returned with a single huff as if reporting back. "Good boy," Walt said, giving the dog a quiet pat before looking at her again. "Come on, let's get you back in before you freeze." She followed him, glancing once more over her shoulder at the fading lines. They seemed both terrible and strangely empowering now. They were proof that she hadn't been erased. The storm hadn't won. Someone else who followed this story could know what happened. Back at the porch, Walt paused to stomp snow from his boots and hung the lantern on a hook. Its glow fell gently across her face, making the cold dampness on her cheeks shine faintly. "You did right coming to light," he said quietly, almost to himself. Claire exhaled and felt her body tremble from more than cold. She stepped inside ahead of him, the warm cabin air closing around her like a blanket. Behind her, Walt latched the door with quiet finality, and Duke shook snow from his coat with a soft rattle. The night still pressed against the windows, but the evidence of her survival was now marked and known. Faint tracks on fresh snow, seen and recorded before the storm could erase them. The walk back to the cabin felt longer, though it could not have been more than a few hundred yards. The woods had changed while they were out. The faint clouded sky she had first seen when stepping onto the porch had cleared in places, and now cold stars spilled across it in hard, perfect points. They were beautiful in a way that felt cruel, diamond sharp and infinitely far away, watching without warmth. The air seemed to deepen around her, the cold no longer a shifting presence, but a dense, living thing. She tucked her chin into the damp collar of her coat and tried to keep her hands jammed deep into her pockets, but they still ached and throbbed with returning blood. Walt didn't hurry, but moved with quiet, practiced steps, lantern swinging just enough to throw a trembling golden circle ahead of them. Each swing caught on low branches, turning ice into brief flashes before the dark swallowed them again. Duke stayed close to Claire now, brushing her leg occasionally with a reassuring weight of fur and warmth. She found herself grateful for the dog's company. The steady rhythm of his paws, the faint huff of breath, something alive beside her in the vast cold. She thought she'd be braver after seeing the tracks, after proving the night couldn't erase her. But as soon as the lantern light turned away from a road and into the close stand of pines, unease crept back. The dark seemed thicker between the trees. Each small sound, a shifting branch, snow falling from a limb, felt sharp and amplified. Yet every time she looked toward Walt's broad back and the unhurried way he walked, some measure of calm returned. He didn't talk. She didn't either. Their breath and the faint squeak of snow were the only sounds, except once when Duke paused and gave a low, contented grunt before trotting ahead. She wondered briefly what Walt was thinking, whether he was angry on her behalf, or just practical, cataloging details for the call he'd make later. His silence wasn't heavy, though. It was protective, like the quiet inside a church when candles burn. The cabin appeared suddenly between the trees, its window a warm square of gold that looked impossibly inviting after the black woods. For a moment, she had the disorienting sense of approaching a ship after drifting in open water, light and safety waiting. Her legs almost buckled with relief. "Careful here," Walt said, his first word since they'd left the road, when the porch steps appeared under the drifting snow. His voice was steady but softer than before, carrying an easy patience. She climbed up behind him, boots clumsy, grateful when he turned and offered a gloved hand. His palm was calloused and strong, the contact brief but anchoring. Once she was steady, he swung the lantern to a hook by the door, then pushed it open. Heat spilled out, washing over her face like a wave. The scent of wood smoke and pine returned, grounding and safe. She stepped inside and felt her muscles give way, shaking as the warmth closed around her again. The room looked exactly as they'd left it. The map on the wall, the chairs by the stove, Duke's bed, yet felt transformed by the journey. It was no longer just a cabin. It was sanctuary, earned through cold and dark. Walt shut the door firmly, latched it, and stamped the snow from his boots before hanging the parka back on its peg. He looked at her briefly to be sure she was steady, then moved to add wood to the stove. The fire roared higher, pushing back every trace of night that clung to her coat. Claire sank into the same chair she'd used earlier, wrapping the quilt back around her shoulders. The heat seeped slowly into her skin, almost painful in its return but then easing, loosening her stiff spine and burning out the deep chill. She pressed her hands against a mug Walt soon refilled for her and closed her eyes, breathing in steam until she could feel her fingers again. Outside, the wind rose once, rattling branches, but now it sounded far away. Here there was only the crackle of fire and the quiet creak of logs shifting as they burned. Walt glanced at her once, nodded, a silent check-in, then turned back to the stove and the low murmur of the radio still alive on the shelf. Its soft static felt like a lifeline stretching into the night. She realized she was no longer listening for Mark's engine. That part of her had gone quiet, somewhere between the stars and the lantern light. Instead, she felt the weight of her own survival settling in, a solid, unfamiliar thing. She was still shaking, but it was no longer just cold. It was a release of having reached light and warmth again. When she looked up, Walt was sitting across from her, coffee steaming in his hands. He met her eyes for a brief second and gave the faintest nod, not a smile exactly, but mark of recognition. "You made it. You're safer now?" She returned it, and the silence that followed felt almost gentle. The night could still do what it wanted outside. Here, she had a place, a map, a voice on the radio, and a man who knew how to face the dark. Warmth crept slowly into her frozen fingers, and with it came the first fragile sense that the worst might be behind her. The fire had burned low enough that only deep orange coals glowed under the stove's iron belly. Walt fed in another split log, careful and slow, the smell of resin and charred pine briefly flaring, before the door clanged shut again. Claire sat wrapped in the quilt, both hands curled around her mug, though the tea inside had long gone cold. Her body was warmer now but heavy, as if thawing had melted more than the ice in her veins. It had softened walls she'd kept standing for years. Walt lowered himself into the other chair with a small groan of old wood and older joints. For a while neither spoke. Outside, the wind had eased, trading its earlier howls for soft sighs through the trees. The radio still murmured faint static and occasional clipped voices, a patrol car checking in, a dispatcher confirming road ice. Proof of life out there, but none of it demanded attention. When Walt finally spoke, his voice was so quiet it almost blended with the stove's creak. "You want to call it in?" The word seemed to land inside her rather than just reach her ears. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the map on the wall, at the dotted line of her walk and the careful notes he'd written. She looked at Duke asleep by the door, chin on paws, his breathing slow and steady. She looked at the lantern still hanging near the entry, dry snow melting in tiny droplets beneath it. Then she nodded, once deliberate but shaking all the same. Walt didn't move yet. He studied her face, the way her jaw trembled and her eyes darted, as if checking she hadn't overstepped some invisible rule. "You sure?" he asked, not doubting but offering a pause if she needed it. She swallowed and forced herself to meet his eyes. "Yes." The word was soft, but not small. I can't go back like nothing happened." Something unreadable flickered across his features. Maybe respect, maybe sadness. All right. She felt tears threaten and quickly bit them back. For so long, every bad night had ended with retreat. Smoothing things over, swallowing words, telling herself it wasn't enough to matter. Tonight, something had cracked under the cold in the road and the vision of his taillights disappearing while she stood helpless and alone. It wasn't just anger or fear. It was a sudden, undeniable truth that she couldn't stay inside that life and survive. Walt leaned forward and picked up the radio mic. "County, this is Briggs." His voice changed slightly, that old badge-worn steadiness coming back. Got additional on the stranded party. He glanced at her, gave her space to stop him if she changed her mind. She didn't. Requesting unit response to Pike Creek cabin. Possible domestic abandonment. Female safe, but vehicle driven off westbound. Static crackled. Then a woman's voice came clear. "Copy, Briggs. We'll send 2 cars." ETA maybe an hour. Road still rough. Understood. Walt clicked off and set the mic down gently. Then he looked at her again, not primed but present. They're coming. Claire closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. She hadn't realized how much she'd braced with the idea of no help at all, how far gone that hope had fell out on the road. Now, with a stranger's voice promising arrival, something heavy slipped off her shoulders. "You okay?" Walt asked after a beat. "No," she said truthfully, and surprised herself by not apologizing for it. "But better." He nodded, as if that was enough. "That's fine." She stared at the coals glowing in the stove, their quiet pulse. A thought surfaced. What Lila would say if she knew her mother had walked miles through snow and ended up in a cabin with a dog and a man who once wore a badge. She pictured telling her someday, not tonight but later, that leaving isn't weakness, that there are people who will help when darkness comes. Minutes passed. Walt refilled her mug with fresh hot water, the simple kindness cutting to the swirl of fear and relief. She held it close and whispered, mostly to herself, "Something broke tonight." "Good," Walt said softly, surprising her. At her startled look he added, "Sometimes that's the only way out." She stared at him, absorbing the quiet truth of it, then gave a small, raw nod. She didn't know yet what she would do tomorrow or how she would explain any of this to her daughter, but she knew she would not climb back into Mark's car and pretend. In the cabin stillness, with the dogs sighing at their feet and the world outside sharpened by stars, Claire let herself feel that small, fierce certainty. The night might have tried to erase her, but here she was, warm, alive, waiting for help and done with disappearing. Walt waited a few beats after the last check-in chatter faded, then picked up the mic again, his broad thumb pressing the worn transmit button with practiced ease. The cabin's quiet seemed to tilt forward with him, as if even the dog knew this was a moment that mattered. Claire sat still under the quilt, her breath a little faster, eyes on his hands in the slow, deliberate way he turned the frequency knob until the static thinned to a workable hum. "County Dispatch. This is Briggs at Pike Creek Cabin," he said, voice deep and steady, the kind of voice that makes you want to believe things will hold. "Requesting direct line on the stranded party we discussed." There was a pause, long enough that Claire's heart ticked fast against her ribs. Then a new voice cracked through. Female, even but brisk, the kind of calm that lives just above urgency. "This is Deputy Ellis." "Copy you, Briggs. Go ahead." Relief hit, so suddenly her eyes burned. Walt nodded once to himself before answering. "Got a victim of domestic abandonment. Female, mid-30s. Left on road near mile marker 27 off Route 6. Severe cold exposure, but stable. No contact with suspect vehicle since drop-off." There was a brief static pop, then the deputy's voice again, closer now, more focused. "Understood. Can you confirm name?" Walt turned his head toward Claire. "Your name, ma'am," he said, gentle but clear. She cleared her throat. Still rough. "Claire Bennett." He pressed the mic again. "Name is Claire Bennett." "Copy Claire Bennett," Deputy Ellis replied, her voice carrying a note of quiet concern now. "Is she safe to remain with you until we arrive?" Walt looked at her and let her answer. She managed a nod, pulling the quilt closer around her shoulders. "Yes," Walt said for her. "Warm now. We have shelter, heat, first aid." "Good," came the answer, professional but not cold. "Roads partially plowed but icing. Our ETA about an hour. Stay put. Do not attempt to walk out." "Copy will stay," Walt said. His eyes softened slightly as he glanced at Claire again, and there was a quiet weight in that look, a promise that he meant it. Deputy Ellis's voice came again, slower this time, less clipped but still official. "Briggs, any details on suspect? Vehicle make, plate direction?" Walt raised an eyebrow at Claire, inviting her to speak. Her voice trembled but held. "Black SUV, 2015 maybe. Ford Explorer. Plate." She stopped, squeezed her eyes shut, then whispered the numbers she could remember. Walt repeated them into the mic, careful and precise. "Westbound after drop. Approximately 9:15 departure from Miller's Diner." "Copy. Black Explorer partial plate confirmed. We'll put out Bolo." Any weapons, known threats? Deputy Ellis asked. Claire hesitated, then shook her head slowly. No, not tonight. Just angry. Negative on weapons, Walt relayed. But advise caution. Understood. Units en route. A pause and softer. Ms. Bennett, you're safe now. We got you logged and coming your way. The radio clicked silent again, but the words hung warm in the cabin, filling space that hours earlier had belonged to loneliness and cold. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, the sound ragged but real. Walt set the mic down gently, then leaned back, stretching one knee until it popped. That's the right call, he said. His voice wasn't congratulating so much as stating a fact, but it landed like reassurance. Claire stared at the black box of the radio, the little green glow still pulsing, alive with connection. She sounded sure, she murmured, voice small but steady. She is, Walt said, reaching for his mug. Good cop, knows her roads, knows how to get where she's going. Something shifted in Claire's chest, fragile but firming. A sense of being located, placed back on a map she thought she'd fallen off of. She leaned back in the chair, fingers curling around the mug's heat, and felt her pulse slow a little. The room settled into a gentle rhythm. The quiet scrape of Duke's claws as he turned a slow circle before lying down again. The crackle of the stove swallowing another log. The muted thrum of voices still trading codes far away. Outside, the night pressed cold against the glass, but it no longer felt infinite. After a while, Walt broke the quiet again, softer this time. They'll get here, roads or no roads. She nodded, tears threatening but not spilling, and whispered, Thank you for calling. He shrugged one shoulder, eyes on the fire. Somebody needed to, might as well be me. And just like that, the terror that had ruled the night loosened another fraction. She wasn't alone in the dark with anymore. She was a name on a radio, a woman expected and protected, with warm air at her back and help moving toward her through the icy miles. It began as a faint color where there had been none before, a soft flicker between the dark trunks, far down the hidden road. Claire was the first to see it. She had been staring at the window for what felt like hours, listening to the stove sighs and the radio's occasional bursts of coded language. When that dim, pulsing glow appeared between the pines, her breath caught before she could speak. Walt followed her gaze, leaned slightly toward the glass, and gave the barest nod. That'll be them. His voice was low but certain. The light came closer by degrees, blue and red pulses, sliding across the white ground and catching ice on low branches until the forest seemed alive with cold fire. At first the sound didn't carry, just a silent choreography of colors drifting nearer. Then, slowly, came the soft crunch and grind of tires on hard-packed snow, measured and careful, the low murmur of engines fighting ice. Claire stood without realizing she'd moved. Her legs wavered but held. She gripped the back of the chair for balance, quilt trailing behind her like a cape. Walt rose too, slower, pulling on his park again but not yet reaching for the door. Duke lifted his head, ears pricked, a low rumble of interest rather than warning vibrating through the quiet cabin. The first cruiser slid into view, headlights dim but bar light steady, the blue-red wash making the trees lurch and shimmer. Another followed close behind, tires cutting wide arcs into the untouched snow. They rolled forward until the small clearing glowed with that unmistakable law enforcement palette. Not harsh, just official and solid in the wild night. Engines idled. Steam curled from exhaust pipes and mingled with the lantern light, still swinging faintly by the door. Walt glanced at Claire once more. You ready? She swallowed. Her throat felt dry and thick. Yes, she whispered, not entirely believing it, but unwilling to step back now. He opened the door and the cold came in fast, sharp and metallic after the hours of safety. Duke bounded forward and stopped just at the edge of the porch, watchful but calm. Two figures emerged from the first car, moving with deliberate caution on the slick ground. One was a tall man in a heavy black jacket. The other a woman with a sheriff's badge catching the light on her chest, and a steady beam from her flashlight cutting a clear path. Maya Ellis, the woman called, voice carrying firm and even, County Sheriff's Office. Walt lifted his hand in greeting, but stayed where he was until they came closer. "Briggs," he answered. "Got her safe and warm." Claire's breath came uneven, but she stayed by the doorframe, half in the cabin's heat and half out in the cold, eyes fixed on the approaching deputies. Something about the sight. Uniforms, sure footing, the easy weight of authority. Loosened a knot she hadn't known she still carried. Maya reached the porch first, flashlight dipping politely to avoid blinding. Her face came into view, serious, calm, young but anchored. She took in Claire with one quick sweep of understanding, and then softened her tone. "Miss Bennett." Claire managed a small nod. "You're safe now," Maya said simply, not filling the air with pity or chatter. Just the fact. Another deputy moved past, circling the clearing with the careful watchfulness of someone trained to read the night. Walt stepped back to let Maya and Claire stand face to face. "You cold?" Maya asked. "I'm better," Claire answered, voice catching. Maya nodded once. "Good. Let's keep you inside while we sort what we can." They entered the cabin together, boots thumping in snow, dripping onto the mat by the door. The radios clipped to their shoulders hissed quietly, adding another thread of life to the room. The warmth hit the deputies hard enough to fog their glasses and draw a quick exhale from the man behind Maya. Walt shut the door firmly, sealing out the cold again. The blue and red lights still danced faintly across the frosted window panes, proof that the outside world had arrived but could not intrude too far. For a moment, Claire stood there clutching the quilt, dizzy with the contrast. Hours alone and invisible, and now two strangers in heavy coats looking at her not like a nuisance or an inconvenience, but as someone to help. Maya unzipped her jacket halfway and knelt slightly so her eyes were level with Claire's. "We're going to ask a few questions. Get details on your husband and vehicle. Then we'll see about next steps, okay?" Claire nodded again, a little steadier this time. "Okay." Walt settled into his chair quietly, letting the professionals take the lead, but staying close enough that she could feel his presence. Duke curled back onto the rug, satisfied. Outside, the cruisers idled in the snow, light still casting long shifting colors through pines, a silent promise that the long, cold isolation of the road was over. Inside, warmth gathered around Claire in layers. The stove's deep glow, the quiet work of the deputies, and the solid nearness of the man who had opened his door. She was no longer lost in the dark. People had found her and stepped into the night on her behalf. The cabin door latched softly behind the deputies, sealing the night outside. Their radio still whispered now and then, but otherwise the space felt hushed and close, lit by the orange pulse of the stove and the lantern on the table. Claire sat where Walt had first placed her, the quilt drawn around her shoulders again, though the heat had returned to her hands enough that she no longer shook when she held the mug. Deputy Maya Ellis took a seat across from her, setting a small notepad on the table but not opening it right away. The other deputy, a quiet man named Franklin, stayed by the door, occasionally leaning down to scratch Duke's ears, watchful but not intrusive. Maya's voice, when it came, was gentle but exact. "I'd like to get some details if you're ready. We'll keep it simple. You just talk and I'll write what we need." She paused long enough for Claire to nod. "Start wherever makes sense to you." For a moment, Claire stared into the mug's surface as if it might hold the words. Then they came, halting at first, but clear enough. "We left dinner around 9:15. Miller's Diner." She glanced at Walt for confirmation, and he gave her a small nod, as though to say, "Yes, you remembered right." "We argued in the car. Nothing big at first. Directions a wrong turn. He was angry. He gets angry a lot." Maya opened her notebook, pen moving quietly. She didn't look up with every detail. She just let the story breathe. Claire spoke slowly, each word pulled from somewhere she'd kept sealed for years. He pulled over eventually, shouldered the road, said if I knew better I could walk. I thought he was bluffing, but he told me to get out and he drove away. She swallowed, rubbed her thumb along the mug's rim. I stood there a long time. Then I walked. Maya's eyes lifted once, steady and kind but without pity. Has this happened before? Being left somewhere. Claire hesitated. Not like this. She took a breath, found the strength to continue. But there's been things. Yelling, shoving. Once last spring, He pushed me against the doorframe. I had a bruise here. She touched the side of her arm. He said it wasn't on purpose, that I was in the way. Maya wrote but slowly, letting silence come between sentences so Claire didn't feel rushed. Any other injuries? Small ones. Claire's voice was flat, matter-of-fact now. Bruises on my wrist from when I tried to leave a fight. I never called anyone. I kept thinking it would stop if I didn't make it worse. Walt shifted slightly in his chair, but said nothing. The only sound was a pen scratching, the dog's soft sigh. Maya nodded once, not in approval or judgment, but in understanding. You did what you had to. Tonight's different. You're safe here. She looked up fully now. When he left you, did he threaten to come back? No, Claire said, and that truth surprised her. He just left. He didn't look back. Okay. Maya's voice softened. That helps. We'll still treat it seriously. Claire found herself breathing easier, with every answer given and written down. It was strange. Speaking these things aloud didn't break her. It steadied her. The facts hung in the warm air like stones finally set down. Maya glanced toward Walt. Mr. Briggs, you've got the timeline and location? Walt gave a low hum, marked it on the map. Car headed westbound after mile 27. Partial plate logged. Maya jotted that, then closed her notebook carefully. That's enough for now. We'll file an incident report, issue a bolo on the vehicle. There'll be follow-up, but tonight we just get you safe. Claire exhaled, long and quiet. Something inside her, the piece that had stayed clenched since the road, began to release. Maya studied her another moment, then said, We can arrange a safe place for the night. Friend, family, or we can take you in until someone picks you up. You don't have to decide yet. Claire nodded slowly. I might call my sister, she murmured. Tomorrow. Good, Maya said simply. No rush. The deputies rose, not abrupt, but with the deliberate care of people who know how to leave space behind them. Franklin gave Duke a final scratch and said, almost gently, Good dog. Walt stood too, but his hands stayed loose at his sides, no pressure, just presence. Claire remained seated, suddenly aware that the story was out there now, living beyond her, in the deputy's notes in the map, in the voices on the radio. It was no longer just her burden to carry alone. For a heartbeat, the room was silent again, but it was a different kind of quiet than when she first arrived. Not empty, not dangerous, just still. The calm that comes after a first hard truth has been spoken. Maya looked back once before stepping out. We'll take care of the rest, she said. You just stay warm. And for the first time since she'd stepped into the freezing night, Claire believed it. The deputies moved with quiet efficiency. Speaking to each other in low tones meant not to startle. Maya set her notepad aside and slipped a phone from her jacket pocket, its camera lens catching the warm firelight for a brief second before she turned the brightness down. Claire, she said gently, I'm going to take a few quick photos, just to document what we see tonight. It's standard. Is that okay? Claire hesitated, instinct flaring to hide, to pull the quilt tighter. But she looked at Walt, still seated just to her left, solid and calm, and then back to Maya. It's okay, she said softly, surprising herself. Good. Just stay where you are. Maya stepped back a few paces and began quietly snapping images. The first clicks caught the damp weight of Claire's coat where it lay draped across the chair back, sleeves darkened from melted snow and faint salt lines tracing the seams. She knelt for a closer shot of collar and shoulders, murmuring a quick time and date stamp under her breath. Franklin stood nearby, jotting details in a small black field book, his gloved thumb running along the page edge as he wrote. Maya's eyes stayed professional but not cold. She moved the camera to Claire herself then, careful not to push too close. Hands, if you don't mind, she said. Claire uncurled her fingers slowly. They were pale from cold but blotched with returning pink where the blood was warming them again. Knuckles slightly scraped from her fall earlier on the icy road. She held them still while Maya took 2 quick shots, the shutter's soft snick sounding louder than it was. Thank you, Maya said, almost tender in its simplicity. She shifted to catch Claire's face. turning the camera slightly so the light from the stove showed the raw wind burn along her cheeks and the faint split on her bottom lip. Each photograph was quick but deliberate, a record rather than an intrusion. Claire sat very still through it, a strange calm overtaking the first flicker of shame. She had spent years smoothing over every mark and moment, pretending nothing happened. Now someone was seeing, naming, preserving, and instead of feeling exposed, it felt oddly like armor being built around her. When Maya finished, she slid the phone back into her jacket and gave a small nod. That's all we need for now. Franklin added a few last notes, then asked in a quiet drawl, "Any other belongings we should document?" "Phone." Claire blinked. "It's dead. In my coat pocket." Walt moved before she had to, reaching for the coat and retrieving the phone, handling it as if it might break. He passed it to Franklin without a word. His nearness was steadying. He didn't hover, but he was there, an unmistakable presence at her side. Franklin checked the phone briefly, read the cracked screen and failing battery, and wrote something down before setting it gently back where it came from. "We'll log it," he said, "in case there's messages or call records you want later." Through it all, Walt stayed quiet, leaning slightly forward in his chair, hands loose but ready. Claire could feel his watchfulness, not interfering, not taking control, just ensuring she didn't feel alone. It was the same kind of protective stillness he'd held on the snowy road, a shield that asked for nothing in return. Maya looked at Claire again when the last note was taken. "You doing okay?" The question was simple but weighty. Claire swallowed and managed a small nod. "I think so." "You did everything right tonight," Maya said, tucking the notepad away. "Leaving that road, finding help, coming inside, that saved you." Claire let the words settle. They sounded foreign, but also true. Walt's gaze flicked to her, and there was a small, almost smile, the kind that doesn't show teeth, just quiet agreement. The deputy stepped aside, confer quietly near the door, radioing brief updates back to dispatch. Their clipped speech and static murmurs filled the cabin with a reassuring hum, the sense that machinery larger than her pain was now moving on her behalf. Claire sat back, quilt gathered at her throat, and felt the first edges of exhaustion, deep bone heavy, but no longer panicked. For the first time in hours, maybe years, she didn't feel like she had to watch every doorway in shadow alone. When the deputies returned, Maya glanced once more at Walt, then at Claire. "We'll get you out safely when the plow passes. Stay warm a little longer." Claire nodded, voice too small to use but enough to show she'd heard. The photos were done, the notes taken, the story recorded. She was still herself, cold, shaken, but now there was a record of her night beyond memory alone. Someone else had seen and written and witnessed. And in that quiet warmth, with Walt's protective stillness nearby and the deputy's calm movement filling the cabin, Claire felt the weight of isolation lift another degree, replaced by something like fragile safety. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm again. The stove hummed low and deep, the smell of pine sap drifting as another log caught. Maya and Franklin spoke softly near the door, trading clipped details over their radios, while Walt poured fresh coffee into 2 mugs. Claire stayed wrapped in the quilt, watching the fire shift and sigh, the first fragile edges of exhaustion slipping over her shoulders now that adrenaline was receding. For a moment, she let herself believe the night was done. The help was fully here and the road was behind her. Then a sudden crackle from Maya's shoulder might cut through the hush. The deputy straightened, fingers going to the radio before it had finished its burst of static. "Ellis," she answered crisply. A male dispatcher's voice came back, distorted but clear enough. "Unit 3, you still at Pike Creek with the party?" "Affirmative," Maya replied, glancing instinctively at Claire as she spoke. "What's up?" There was a small pause, the sound of paper, perhaps, or keys. Then the voice returned, low but definite. "Got a hit on the vehicle plate you called in. Black Explorer partial matched at Ridgeway Gas and Market about an hour ago. Camera confirmed, male driver alone, dark jacket. Heading westbound, possibly towards State Route 17. Maya's eyes flicked to Franklin and then to Walt, who had frozen halfway to setting the coffee down. She spoke back into the mic with cool precision. "Copy Ridgeway Gas, westbound towards 17. Timestamp, 0100 hours. Pumped gas and left, the voice replied. No sign of passenger. Claire felt her stomach drop in a way she hadn't expected. The words didn't bring fear so much as a sudden, sharp clarity. Mark was real out there somewhere, not just a phantom she'd escaped. He had stopped, fueled up, moved on. He hadn't looked back, hadn't called, hadn't searched. Something hard and brittle inside her cracked but didn't break. Instead, she felt a strange, hot steadiness crawl up her spine. Maya kept her eyes on Claire while answering. 10-4. Keep eyes on. We're with victim and stable. We'll advise if she's ready for next steps. Copy. County out. The radio clicked silent. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Duke shifting by the stove, nails soft against the floorboards. Then Maya stepped closer to Claire, kneeling slightly so she didn't tower over her. That was dispatch, she said gently but without sugarcoating. They found your husband's vehicle on camera about an hour back. He's not here. He's moving west. Claire blinked slowly, absorbing each word. So, they know where he went. They know enough, Maya said. If he heads farther out, State Patrol can pick up the plate. He's not circling back this way. Road conditions wouldn't allow it easy. Claire let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief mixed with raw grief she hadn't let herself feel. Confirmation always cuts both ways. He didn't even check. Walt spoke for the first time in several minutes, voice low, but carrying something like grim respect. Shows what you're dealing with. You're seeing it clear now. She turned slightly toward him. His gaze was steady, not gloating, just quietly affirming what had been dangerous to admit. Maya gave her a moment, then continued. This helps us build a protective order, if you want one. We can get the state on alert if he tries to come near. It also means you're not waiting on unknowns tonight. Claire nodded faintly, pulling the quilt closer. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt seen, tracked, not abandoned to the dark unknown. It was enough. Franklin scribbled a few notes by the window, his voice low as he radioed the update back in shorthand. Walt finally set the coffee down within her reach and stepped back, but stayed close. Thank you, Claire managed, her voice cracking just slightly, for telling me straight. That's how we work, Maya said simply. Better to know the shape of it. The room felt different now. Still warm, still safe, but alive with something sharper than before. Information, evidence, a line connecting what happened to what comes next. Outside, the pines whispered and the blue-red lights in the cruisers pulsed against the snow. But inside, she no longer felt like prey waiting in the dark. The man who had driven off had a direction, a timestamp, a plate number. She had a name and a record and people on her side. She sat a little taller, without meaning to. The shaking in her hands hadn't fully gone, but her breathing was deeper, less frantic. She caught Walt watching her with quiet approval before he looked away again, as if giving her space to own the moment. Maya finally stood and spoke into her mic once more, brief and efficient, then turned back. We'll stay put until the plow comes through. Then we can escort you out, wherever you choose to go. Claire nodded again. She didn't know yet where that would be. Sister's house, maybe, anywhere but home. But for the first time tonight, the question felt like hers to answer. And outside, somewhere far down the highway, Mark was just another set of numbers on a screen, not a shadow waiting in the dark. The moment the radio update ended, the cabin shifted again, its air tightening with quiet purpose. Maya and Franklin exchanged a glance that spoke more than words. Years of working nights on frozen backroads had taught them how to move without fuss when things turned serious. Maya murmured something into her mic, a clipped sequence of numbers and codes that Claire couldn't catch, and then gestured subtly toward the door. Franklin nodded, zipping his jacket before stepping out first, careful not to let it more cold than necessary. Maya followed a second later, pulling the door closed behind them with a deliberate softness that still managed to sound final. For a beat, the absence of their presence felt like another drop into darkness. Then the stove's hum reasserted itself, and Duke shifted closer to Claire's chair, curling up against her boots with a heavy sigh. Walt didn't move for a moment, listening to the faint murmur of voices outside, urgent but controlled, too quiet to follow. Then he stood, moved to the small stovetop where a dented pot sat, and lifted the lid. The rich scent of chicken and vegetables drifted into the warm air. Claire realized how long it had been since she'd eaten. The smell hit her like an ache. Walt ladled steaming broth and soft noodles into a chip bowl, added a cracked pepper shake without asking, and brought it over. He set it gently on the low table beside her with a spoon. No flourish, no commentary, just something human and sustaining. She managed a faint smile that didn't quite form. "Thank you." He gave a small grunt, not dismissive, just a quiet acknowledgement, and lowered himself back into his chair across from her. "Eat a little," he said softly. "Warms you better than coffee." The first sip burned her tongue slightly, but settled in her chest like life itself. She hadn't realized how empty she was until that moment. Her body trembled with gratitude and exhaustion. Walt leaned back, one big hand draped loosely across his knee, the other cupping his mug. He wasn't staring at her, but he was not watching either. It was a quiet guard, the way someone keeps an eye on a storm just beyond the window. Outside, she caught flashes of blue and red light, sweeping across the snow as the cruisers idled. Through the window's frosted glass, Maya's silhouette moved briskly, her radio lifted near her shoulder, head bent as she spoke. Franklin stood a little farther off, scanning the tree line and the dark road beyond, his hand near his flashlight, but not on his weapon. The tone of their movements was unmistakable, deliberate, contained, protective. Claire ate slowly, the heat spreading back into her fingers, her chest easing with each swallow. When the spoon clinked softly against the bowl, Walt glanced at her, eyes sharp but kind. "They'll be making sure you're covered," he said, quiet enough to keep the night from hearing. "Bolo's going out. Means every unit gets the plate, the lookout. If he tries to head back this way, someone will know." Her shoulders loosened a fraction. "Bolo?" she repeated, the word unfamiliar on her tongue. "Be on the lookout," he translated simply. "Statewide ping. They'll run him quiet but sure." The idea of so many invisible eyes searching for black SUVs sent an unexpected shiver of safety through her. Mark, who'd always seemed unstoppable, unseen, was now marked. Other people knew. "They can do that so fast?" she asked. "They just did." Walt sipped his coffee, the faintest hint of grim satisfaction in the gesture. Through the glass came another flicker of red-blue. Then the deputies' shapes returned. They paused near the cruisers, still talking low but with less edge now, the urgency settling into steady procedure. Claire caught Maya's voice for just a moment as the wind shifted. "Protective order, warrant, if needed, confirmed probable. The rest is all back into the cold." Claire sat very still, the soup warming her from inside, while those words swirled and sank. Protective order, warrant. Legal words she had avoided for years because they felt dangerous to even consider. Tonight they sounded less like threat, and more like something solid between her and the dark. Walt must have seen the flicker of feeling cross her face, because he spoke again, quiet, even. "Doesn't mean tomorrow's easy. Just means you're not alone anymore." She swallowed and nodded, unable for a reply that wouldn't break something inside her. He let the silence sit between them, without rushing to fill it. Minutes later the door opened, and a gust of cold swept in with Maya and Franklin. They stamped snow off their boots, but didn't shake it loose like strangers, more like guardians returning. Maya's eyes met Claire's and softened just slightly. "We're good," she said. "Alert's out. County and state have his description. We'll file the protective paperwork first thing." Claire nodded, throat tight. Walt didn't move except to top her soup again, quiet as always. The night outside still belonged to the winter woods, but inside the cabin something new had taken root, an invisible net tightening far beyond these walls. For the first time since she'd been left on the side of the road, Claire felt a system bending toward her instead of away. And next to her, Walt kept silent watch, big hands wrapped around his mug, every inch a sentinel who had decided she was worth saving. The fire had settled into a slow, pulsing glow, the kind of heat that seeps into bone rather than bites at the surface. Claire sat close, palms out toward the stove until her fingers tingled with returning life. At first, she only stared at the orange light under the iron door, following the hypnotic rise and fall of flames and embers. Then, Almost without noticing, her breath began to slow and deepen. The storm that had rattled in her chest since the roadside was easing, replaced by something heavier but steadier, the slow awareness that she was alive and somewhere safe. Behind her, Walt moved quietly, the scrape of chair legs against plank floor the only sound besides the low rumble of the stove. He didn't speak. He just checked on Duke, gave the dog a slow rub between the ears, and poured fresh water from the kettle into her mug. The deputies had retreated again to a soft-voiced conference near the door. Radios clipped low, their presence calm but purposeful. The occasional burst of static from their shoulder mics felt less jarring now, more like a heartbeat, steady and protective. Claire rubbed her palms together and turned them to the heat again. The numbness had gone. What lingered was ache and soreness, but the cold no longer frightened her. Fear had taken on a different shape altogether. It wasn't the sharp panic of headlights fading or the helpless cold on the road. It was clearer now, quieter, edged with resolve. The knowledge of what she could not return to. For years she had measured nights like this by survival. Stay small, stay quiet, let the anger burn out and wait for morning. But tonight there would be no waiting for him to come back, no inventing excuses for neighbors or her daughter. Something had shifted out there under the stars when she kept walking, and it had solidified here with the map and the radio and the kind, brisk efficiency of people who believed her story on the first telling. Maya glanced over from the door and caught Claire's eyes, offering a brief, wordless nod. Not pity, just acknowledgement. "You're doing it," that nod seemed to say. Claire gave the faintest return nod and felt a surprising flush of strength. She thought of her daughter then. The quiet calls at night when Mark was out late, the way she'd learned to gauge the weight of footsteps and the temperature of silence. Claire imagined calling her tomorrow, telling her what happened not as confession, but as fact. "I walked away. I'm safe. We're done with pretending." The image was both terrifying and strangely peaceful. No going back now. And for the first time, that wasn't a threat, but a lifeline. Walt shifted closer, setting the mug of hot water on the table beside her. "Still warm?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper. "Yes," she said, and it came out almost strong. He didn't push further. He sat in the other chair, legs long, shoulders easy but alert. The look he gave her wasn't searching. It was more like standing guard without needing to say so. The cabin walls creaked gently in the cold, but it no longer sounded like loneliness pressing in. It sounded like wood and wind, things she could name. Each minute stretched long but not empty, time enough to feel the pieces of herself slotting into new places. Her body was tired beyond measure, but the tremor in her hands had stilled. She felt the strange quiet of courage. Not loud, not cinematic, but the simple insistence that tomorrow would exist and she intended to meet it. Outside, headlights swept briefly as one cruiser repositioned on the track, and the trees lit up again in brief blue and red before going dark. Claire didn't flinch this time. She just watched and let the knowledge settle deeper. She was no longer alone on a road with no map. She had been found. She had found herself. Maya approached after finishing a low conversation with Franklin and crouched slightly to Claire's level. "Plow's making its run," she said softly. "We'll have a clear path soon. You can ride with us if you want. No rush." Claire nodded. Her throat was too tight to answer aloud, but she knew what she'd say soon. She would not return to Mark's house. She would not try to smooth the story into something palatable. There was no going back, and strangely that felt like the first warmth she could trust. Maya touched the edge of the quilt once, a small, human gesture, then stepped back to let her be. Walt stayed where he was, watchful but quiet, the dogs snoring softly at their feet. Claire turned back to the fire, palms open, and felt resolve settle like another layer of heat. She had survived the night's cold and the long miles alone. Now she would survive the rest. For the first time in years, the fear that usually lurked behind her ribs felt small enough to hold. She breathed deeply and let it go a little. Outside, tires crunched and radios murmured. Inside, she sat with warm hands and spine beginning to straighten, waiting not in dread but in quiet courage for whatever came next. The night had stretched on into a deep, suspended quiet. The stove's coals pulsed softly, a muted orange heartbeat that kept the room warm and alive. Claire drifted somewhere between alert and exhaustion, every nerve ready but dulled by the steady rhythm of safety. Walt's slow breathing in the chair across from her, Duke's occasional sigh, the muted voices of the deputies on the radio. Outside, the wind had stilled. Snow no longer fell but hung in the air as a fine, icy haze. Then came the first distant wash of white light against the trees. It wasn't the flicker of patrols circling. This was stronger, wider, cutting across the pines in deliberate sweeps. Walt straightened in his chair before the others reacted, his body angling toward the window. Claire's heartbeat jumped, old fear flaring before she knew why. Maya was already reaching for her radio, her expression sharpening. Franklin slipped quietly toward the door, one hand near his flashlight. Headlights pushed closer, twin beams twisting over the buried lane. Then another pair joined, off to the side, brighter and higher. Spotlights mounted on a cruiser, angling across the road until the clearing pulsed with sudden white glare. For a breath, Claire could see everything outside as though it were daylight. The heavy snow banks, the tire tracks they'd marked earlier, the delicate frost hanging from low branches. And in that raw light, just beyond the cruiser's flank, sat a black SUV Askew on the road. Her throat tightened at once. Even from this distance, she knew the shape, the sloping roofline, the mud splatter on the wheel arches. Mark's car, parked crooked, driver's door cracked open. Two uniformed officers moved carefully near it, their movements deliberate and calm, but undeniably ready. One stood with a shoulder radio tilted toward his mouth. The other kept a watchful eye on the figure by the SUV, Mark, standing half-turned, jacket collar up, hands just visible at his sides. He wasn't lunging, wasn't shouting. Just there, caught in the cold light, looking smaller than she remembered and somehow still unpredictable. Maya's voice cut low and measured as she spoke into her radio. A string of codes and acknowledgments. Franklin cracked the door open just enough to hear the outside chatter, and then shut it again, a quick gust of night air slipping in with him. "Units got him stopped," he said quietly to Maya, not resisting. Claire felt her knees go soft, not from fear alone, but from the weight of finality pressing in. She had imagined this moment in so many ways, screaming, pleading, some explosive confrontation. Instead, it was happening out there in clean silence, officers moving with choreographed steadiness, her husband framed in stark light like a man who had simply run out of road. Walt didn't speak. He just watched her carefully, gauging her breath. She realized her hands were fists against the quilt and forced them to loosen. Maya crouched briefly near her chair. "He's detained," she said, voice gentle but steady. "We have control out there. You're safe in here." Claire nodded, the motion jerky but real. Her chest felt both crushed and strangely free. Outside, one officer stepped forward and spoke to Mark, calm but firm, then guided him slowly toward the cruiser's open back door. Mark didn't fight. He didn't even glance toward the cabin. Or if he did, the headlights and spotlights turned his face into nothing more than a pale blur. A second officer leaned into the SUV, checking the cabin, perhaps logging items, perhaps making sure the vehicle was clear. The radios in the cabin murmured with clipped confirmations. Franklin answered back, his tone low and even. Maya's stand stayed relaxed but ready, her eyes never leaving the window until the scene outside began to quiet. Claire sat very still, letting the truth sink deeper with every breath. She was not out there. She was not the one standing in the cold trying to explain or defend. She was inside, warm, documented, protected, no longer invisible. She thought briefly of the road where he had left her, how endless it had felt, how sure she'd been that no one would come. Now that same night had flipped. Lights and presence and record had found her and found him. It felt surreal. But under that strangeness was something solid, something like safety beginning to root. Walt finally moved, leaning just enough to top off her cup in the kettle, without asking if she wanted it. She took it with shaking hands, but didn't spill. "You're here," he said quietly, a simple fact. She nodded, eyes still fixed on the thin slice of world visible beyond the frosted glass. The black SUV sat dark now, its driver's door shut, two officers near the hood talking softly while their breath fogged in white plumes. The cruiser's lights still strode blue and red across the snow, but the scene felt contained, handled. Maya stood from her crouch and glanced at Claire once more. You did everything you could, she said. And now he's not your problem tonight. The words settled over her like the last quilt layer. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth and exhaustion wash in. Out there, the night was no longer hers to survive. Here, inside the small pool of firelight, she could breathe. The crunch of boots on the icy ground came first, slow and deliberate. Then the muted thud of cruiser doors closing. Claire's head turned before she meant to. Something in the sound rearranged the air inside the cabin. Walt was already standing, one broad hand resting on the back of his chair, his face unreadable but alert. Maya moved toward the door, calm and efficient, checking the radio on her shoulder as if to confirm what she already knew. Franklin's silhouette passed the frosted window a moment before the knock came. 2 measured raps, no threat in them but a quiet authority that still made Claire's breath catch. Walt stepped aside to let Maya answer. She cracked the door just enough to let the cold in without surrendering the room. Outside, blue and red light still pulsed faintly across the trees, but it was softer now, almost rhythmic rather than alarming. The deputy's voice floated in with the cold. "We're bringing him in for confirmation." Claire's stomach turned hard. She'd been bracing for something like this, but hearing it, the heat of the night suddenly this close again, made her throat go dry. Walt's eyes flicked to her, reading the tremor in her hands, but he didn't speak. He just shifted half a step closer, solid and unmoving. The door opened wider and 2 uniformed officers appeared, careful and deliberate on the threshold. Between them, cuffed and silent for the first few seconds, was Mark. His jacket was half unzipped, snow dusting his shoulders, face pale from the cold and from something else. Shock, maybe, or disbelief. The metallic glint of the cuffs caught the lantern light, stark against his dark coat. For an instant, he just stared at the scene. The warm cabin, the deputies, Walt like an immovable post by the stove, and Claire, not lost in the dark but upright, wrapped in a quilt, alive and waiting. Confusion moved across his features first, a flicker of something almost boyish and baffled. But it twisted fast into anger. His eyes found hers and sharpened, a glare rising from whatever place had believed she would stay lost and quiet. "She's safe," Maya said before he could speak, her voice crisp but controlled. "You're under temporary detainment for investigation and protective action. Keep it civil." Mark's mouth opened as if to argue, but the words stuck. He looked from Maya to the other officers, registering the calm but ready stance, and then back to Claire. His breath fogged hard in the cold air, and his jaw clenched. Claire surprised herself by not shrinking. Her heart pounded, but she sat taller, fingers white-knuckled on the mug but not hiding. Something had shifted tonight, and she could feel it now, a quiet line she would not step back across. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence was not surrender anymore. It was choice. Walt took a slow half-step forward, not confrontational, but unmistakably there. His hand stayed loose at his side, but his presence filled the space between her and the man who had left her on the road. One of the officers moved Mark a step back, almost without needing to be asked. "She's making a statement," Maya said to the room at large, but her gaze never left Mark's. "This space is safe until we move her." "Understood." Mark's eyes narrowed, but whatever words he found caught behind his teeth when the deputy's hand on his arm shifted slightly. Not forceful, just a reminder. After a long beat, he nodded once, short and jerky. Claire's pulse hammered but steadied. She saw him see her, saw the moment he registered that the night hadn't gone how he expected, that she wasn't frozen and forgotten on a roadside, but alive, protected, documented. The anger on his face faltered just slightly under that weight. Maya turned to Claire, her voice softening again. "You don't need to speak to him. We'll handle the rest." Claire swallowed hard and nodded. "I don't have anything to say," she whispered, and was startled at how firm it sounded. Walt's eyes met hers briefly, something proud and protective flickering there before he looked back to the deputies. The officers pivoted, guiding Mark back toward the door. His shoulders were tight, breath sharp in the cold. But he didn't fight. One cruiser door opened. The metallic click of the cuffs as he was shifted slightly echoed faintly in the warm room. Then the door shut behind them, and the sound of engines and tires faded into the night. When the silence returned, it was a different silence. Not the fearful quiet of earlier, but the heavy, clean kind that comes after a storm has moved on. Maya closed the door firmly, checked the latch, then turned to Claire. He's in custody for the night. We'll advise next legal steps after you rest. Claire let out a breath so long and shaky it felt like it came from her bones. Walt moved back to his chair, but didn't sit until she looked at him and gave a small nod. I'm okay, or something close. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would hold, but she knew what tonight had given her. Proof she could walk out of the dark and be seen, protected, believed. Mark's anger was real, but it was out there now, behind other hands, under other lights. She was here, alive, safe, and for the first time in years, not alone. The door had just latched behind departing officers when it opened again, not wide, just a careful crack. Maya stepped back in first. Then one of the other deputies leaned partway through, Mark between them for a brief, necessary moment. Procedure, Maya had said softly. Confirm identity, confirm safety. Let Claire decide if she needed to add anything else while he was present. They had promised it would be safe. They had promised he wouldn't be free to move toward her. Mark stood cuffed, shoulders hunched against the cold, breath still coming fast from whatever had passed out by the cruisers. He looked smaller than he once had, but dangerous in a different way, sharp and restless. His gaze snapped to Claire immediately and stayed there, as if the entire world had funneled down to this warm room, where she sat wrapped in a quilt by the stove. For the first time in years, she did not flinch. She didn't shrink or twist her hands. She stayed seated, spine straight though she felt a tremor in her stomach. Her eyes found his and did not move away. He was the one who broke first, his mouth twisting, words spilling in a rush. This is crazy. You! He stopped, voice cracking under the weight of cold and anger. Claire, what are you doing? You wandered off. I didn't know you'd... Hell, you always... She didn't answer. She didn't even blink fast. The quiet she held now wasn't the fearful silence she had lived with for years. It was something new, deliberate and unyielding. She kept her gaze steady, letting him see what he left behind on that road, and what she had become since. A woman who had walked through freezing dark and found her way to light. Mark faltered, confused by the absence of the old apologies, the familiar smallness he expected to meet him. He shifted his weight, eyes darting to Walt, who stood near enough to be a wall but said nothing. Then to Maya's calm, unwavering face. His mouth worked again, desperate for purchase. You're overreacting. I just needed to cool off. I was coming back. Still she didn't speak. The room seemed to get larger with her silence. The stove popped once, sharp in the quiet, and Duke lifted his head, tail thumping once as if punctuating the moment. Maya didn't interrupt, didn't push her to answer, just watched with the alert stillness of someone giving space for courage to breathe. Mark tried again, voice turning softer, almost pleading. Claire, come on. We've had fights before. You know I wouldn't. But the words died under the weight of the night and the witnesses around him. The facts filled the room where excuses faltered. The miles she'd walked, the frost on her coat, the bolo call, the cuffs at his wrists. She let the quiet say what words never could. That she was finished taking blame, finished shrinking herself small enough to fit his anger. That the world had seen and named what happened. That she was not returning. After a long, tense beat, Mark's face hardened, mouth snapping shut, eyes going cold. But even that retreat felt different. It carried no control, only the frustration of a man whose hold had slipped somewhere out on that road. He looked away first. Maya nodded once to the other deputy, and the moment broke. That's enough, she said evenly. We're done here. They turned Mark back toward the door. He went without fight now, jaw locked, steps heavy. The cold swept in and then was gone again as the door closed behind him. Claire's shoulders sagged all at once, but she didn't collapse. She stayed upright, staring at the door long after it shut, until she felt the tremor pass through her body and out. Walt didn't move closer but remained standing nearby, a solid outline at her edge. Maya lingered just long enough to meet her eyes and give the smallest, firmest nod, respect, not pity, before following the others outside. Only when the room was theirs again did Claire let out a long, shaking breath. It sounded almost like release, but not defeat. She touched the quilt at her shoulders and found herself sitting taller still, as if some long-hidden spine had returned. Walt finally stepped forward, set another log in the stove, and glanced at her. "You held your ground," he said quietly. Claire managed a small, honest smile, thin but real. "I'm done being small," she said, and even hearing herself say it felt like breathing after too long underwater. Walt just nodded and took his seat again, hands folded, eyes soft but proud. Outside, the faint hum of engines drifted away into the night. Inside, the cabin stayed warm, bright, safe. And in the silence that followed, Claire felt the shape of a life no longer bent to fear. When the door opened again, it was not with cold night sweeping in, but with quiet procedure returning. Deputy Maya Ellis stepped inside first, her boots careful on the mat, so the melting snow didn't trail too far. Behind her came Franklin, slower, carrying a thick folder he'd taken from one of the cruisers. Walt looked up but stayed seated, giving the deputy space while keeping a solid presence just behind Claire. She pulled the quilt tighter, without meaning to, but this time it wasn't fear. It was bracing for something she knew she could face. Maya approached the heavy wooden table near the stove and set down what she carried. It was simple enough, a plain manila folder and a few clear evidence sleeves, but the sight of it made the night feel real in a new way. She spread things out carefully, one at a time, until a small, undeniable record of the last hours sat before them. First came the photographs. Pale snow marked by faint twin grooves where the SUV had turned away from her, close-up shots of tread patterns Walt had pointed out under the lantern, wide angles of the lane disappearing into dark woods. Each print had a time stamp burned into the corner in yellow. Claire stared at them and felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with recognition. She had not imagined any of it. Every brutal step had left proof. Next came 2 glossy photos of her coat, still damp when the deputies arrived, salt streaks and broken threads sharp under flash. Another sleeve held images of her scraped knuckles, the windburn along her face. She looked down at them and felt no shame, only a slow, steadying anger at what had put her there. Franklin slid a printout across the wood. Call and text logs from her phone, pulled before it died. She saw the unanswered messages she'd sent, one at 9:43 that simply read, "Please don't." No reply. The empty space next to her name glared back in black and white. There was a screenshot of Mark's last outgoing call early that night. Not to her, but to a buddy from work, 10 minutes before he left her. Finally, Maya placed a small digital recorder on the table and tapped it once. "Your statement," she said quietly. "Everything you told us is here, clean and complete." Claire's eyes lingered on the recorder, that small machine holding her voice, the part of her story she had been afraid to name until tonight. It looked almost fragile, but she felt a strange safety in knowing it existed beyond her now. Maya glanced at Walt and then at Claire before speaking. "We wanted you to see what's documented. What's going forward isn't just your word against his. We've got timeline, physical evidence, witness support. He can argue, but facts are heavy." Almost on cue, muffled through the still cracked door, came the sound of Mark's voice from outside where he waited cuffing the cruiser, raised, strained, trying to talk his way free. Even without words clear, the cadence was familiar, defensive, blaming, desperate to retake control. Claire didn't flinch this time. She looked instead at the photos, at the cold math of time and place that stood against his noise. "He's trying to say he came back for you," Franklin said quietly, almost apologetic but firm. "Claims you walked off." Claire swallowed and found her voice, quieter than she meant but sure. "I didn't." Her eyes stayed on the evidence. "And you know that now." Maya nodded once, not needing more. "We know. The record knows." The simplicity of that sentence loosened something deep inside her. Years of being talked over, gaslit, reduced. Answered here by neat, undeniable proof on a table no one could sweep clean. She reached out without fully thinking and touched the edge of one photograph, the one with her footsteps fading toward Walt's cabin. Her fingers rested there just long enough to feel solid ground under them. When she looked up, Walt was watching quietly, his face unreadable but his eyes warm with quiet pride. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Maya began stacking the photos again, careful but efficient, explaining as she worked. We'll log this, file for protective order and warrant review first thing. You'll have a case if you want to press charges. You'll also have immediate distance. He's held tonight on probable endangerment. Claire nodded slowly. The idea of court, of lawyers and paperwork, scared her in some deep, exhausted way, but it didn't undo her. Not now. Seeing her story transformed into paper, and Record made it real enough to fight for. When the deputies finished organizing, Maya paused before closing the folder. What happened to you matters. It's not invisible anymore. Claire met her eyes and gave a small, grateful nod. Thank you, she whispered. Maya's answering look was steady and kind. Then she turned to brief Franklin and Walt in low voices about next steps. Claire sat back, breathing deep, and let her gaze return to the table. Empty now except for the mug Walt had filled again, and felt, for the first time in years, like the truth had weighed on her side. The noise outside could rage and twist, but here, in this warm cabin, there was evidence, witness, and her own unbroken presence. The air in the cabin felt still and watchful after the folder was closed. Outside, the blue and red light continued its silent sweep across the pines, but the pattern had slowed. What had been urgent now felt procedural. The night's heat burned down to quiet embers. Claire stayed where she was, hands curled around her mug, no longer shaking. Walt hadn't sat again. He stood near the stove with one shoulder against the wall, gaze turned toward the small window above Duke's sleeping shape. He was listening more than looking, head tilted just slightly. Maya returned from a brief exchange on her radio, her boots quiet on the plank floor. She spoke softly, not wanting to break whatever fragile calm had formed. "It's time," she said. "They're moving him." Claire didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and drew the quilt closer, not as a shield but as weight, something grounded to hold on to. Walt looked at her once, reading her face, and gave a small nod back. "You're okay," before shifting just enough to stand between her and the door's direct line of sight. The next sounds came in pieces. First, the low metallic jangle of handcuffs, shifting as someone adjusted a grip. Then boots crunching in snow, measured and steady. Voices outside, calm, practiced, not raised. The door opened briefly to admit the night's breath. Cold air swirled across the warm cabin floor and brought with the faint scent of gasoline and pine. Maya stepped halfway out and pulled it to just a crack behind her, standing sentinel as the other deputies handled the rest. Through the thin slit of opening, Claire saw only slices. Mark's dark jacket between two broader shoulders, his head lowered against the cold. No shouting, no last stand, just a stiff, angry quiet that somehow felt smaller than all the noise he had once filled her life with. The officers didn't drag or shove. They guided him the way people move something already decided. A few words passed that she couldn't catch, low and final. Then the sound of the cruiser door opening, hinges squealing faintly in the frozen air. Mark looked up once, maybe toward the cabin, maybe just scanning instinctively, but the bright flood of patrol lights turned his face to pale blur and shadow. If his eyes found hers, she couldn't tell. She didn't move anyway. She stayed seated, chin lifted, not hiding, but she didn't go to the door either. She didn't know him that. A single car door slammed with a hollow, cold echo that traveled through the trees. Another a beat later. Then the crunch of tires biting into snow as the first cruiser turned slowly back toward the plowed track, lights washing briefly across the cabin's walls before sliding away. Maya came back in, shutting the door with careful finality and leaning for a second against the frame. She glanced at Claire first, a quiet check, and then at Walt, giving a small nod. "He's on his way to holding," she said. No incident. Only then did Walt exhale, long and low, the breath of someone who had stayed coiled for hours without showing it. The sound was quiet but full, the kind of sigh that carries relief and vigilance letting go just a little. Claire heard it and felt some mirror piece inside herself loosen too. The cabin seemed to breathe again. Duke rolled onto his side with a groan and a thump of his tail. Walt pushed off the wall and moved the stove, feeding another log into the glowing coals. The smell of sap rose once more, rich and grounding. Claire found herself speaking softly, surprising herself at how steady she sounded. "It's really over for tonight." Walt didn't look up, but gave a single nod. "For tonight, yes." Maya stayed near the door, adjusting her radio. Transport smooth. They'll keep him overnight, and you'll have contact tomorrow with a victim liaison. You're safe here until morning if you want it. Claire looked around the small, sturdy room. The map still pinned, the lantern on its hook, the dog asleep, the man who had opened his door when she knocked on fate itself. "I think I'll stay a little while," she said quietly. "Good choice," Maya answered, her voice gentle now that the danger had passed. Silence returned, but it was not the old, suffocating silence. It was a softer one, filled with the hum of the stove and the low breath of a house that had done its job. Kept her alive, sheltered her until help arrived. Claire set her mug down, stretched her fingers slowly, and realized for the first time that they weren't trembling. Walt caught her looking at the door and said, "He's not coming back here." "I know," she replied, and the words felt solid. Outside, the last flicker of light faded down the road until the pines swallowed it whole. Inside, warmth rose again, enough to reach every corner. Claire leaned back in her chair, tired but not small, and let the new quiet settle. One built from survival, witness, and the slow reclaiming of her own breath. The room felt bigger once the patrol cars were gone, as if the night itself had stretched out and relaxed after holding its breath. Through the small window, Claire could still see a faint glow of taillights far down the ridge, dimming between the trees, until only darkness and the endless drift of snow remained. The pines swayed gently, releasing small cascades of white whenever a branch gave way to its own weight. No more blue or red slicing through, just winter returning to what it had been before everything broke open. Walt eased himself back into his chair with the quiet stiffness of a man whose body has known long nights and cold roads. He didn't speak right away, just rubbed his palms together once and held them toward the stove. The fire was strong again, the log he'd added earlier catching and throwing a deep orange glow across the floor. Duke let out a heavy sigh, rolled once, and pressed himself nearer to the heat, nose twitching in some half-dream. Claire sat still, shoulders slouched but not collapsing, eyes fixed on a window where the last light had vanished. Her breathing sounded loud in the new silence. For hours she had existed on sheer survival, one foot in front of the other through black woods, one shaky breath after another while strangers turned into lifelines. Now that the danger had passed, the body she willed forward began to remember how tired it was. She felt it in her chest first, a deep ache behind the ribs that was more than cold and more than fear. She had not let herself cry and still didn't want to. The ache was enough. "You warm enough?" Walt asked at last. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but there was steel under it, a man's instinct to check the perimeter even now. She nodded without looking away from the window. "Yes, warm." He studied her for a moment longer, then leaned back until the chair creaked. "Snow's lighter now," he said, mostly to fill the space. "Plow'll clear the road soon." Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's strange," she murmured. "I thought the night would just stay like that forever, cold and empty, and now it's just snow again." Walt's eyes softened. "That's how nights are. They pass, even the bad ones." She turned to look at him, startled by how steady his gaze was. "You really didn't have to open your door." He shrugged one shoulder, as if the act were nothing more than reflex. "It's what you do when someone knocks in the dark." Something about the simplicity of that answer landed hard. She stared at him a moment longer, then looked down at her hands. They were warm now, faint pink blooming where there had been numb white. She flexed her fingers slowly, feeling life return. Outside, the snow kept falling in small, drifting sheets, soft and aimless but relentless. Each flake caught the faint glow from the lantern still on its hook, turning the window into a slow-motion field of silver. The storm wasn't gone, but it wasn't vicious anymore. It was just weather, something she could name and watch and not fear. Maya and Franklin had stepped outside to call in final reports, but their voices still floated back faintly, calm and professional. Claire found comfort in their presence, even out of sight. They were part of the quiet now, not a break in it. She glanced at the map on the wall, the penciled marks Walt had made to track her path. The dotted line looked almost fragile, yet was proof of her strength. Mile after mile walked alone, and then a turn toward light. She hadn't known she was capable of it. She did now. Tomorrow, Walt said after a while, his voice still low but certain, we'll figure what you need. Ride with them to town. Call whoever you trust. You'll have choices. Claire looked at him again. Choices. She tested the word as if it were foreign. Yeah. He gave the faintest smile. You've earned that. For a long time, neither spoke. The cabin breathed around them, with snapping softly, kettle ticking as it cooled, Duke's slow, steady breathing. Outside, snow whispered against the glass and blanketed the lane that had carried her here. Claire felt the ache in her chest settle into something steadier. Not peace yet, but the ground beneath it. She knew fear would visit again when the legal process began, when she had explained to her daughter, when she built a life on her own terms. But tonight she was alive, warm, seen, and that was enough. She looked once more at the dark window and didn't flinch. The night no longer belonged to him or to her terror. It was just night, and she had survived it. Walt took a slow sip of his coffee and let out a quiet sigh, one of deep, bone-level relief. She didn't say anything, but she felt the sound echo inside her. It was the first exhale of a long fight ending. Snow still fell, but softly now, like the world turning a page. And inside the little cabin, Claire sat in its glow, not small anymore, waiting for morning. The morning came pale and gray, without sunrise but with a slow easing of night into a softer light. Snow still sifted from the branches, but no longer hunted the cabin. It floated down lazily, catching in the ruts left by the cruisers. Inside, warmth lingered from the stove, but the air held the quiet heaviness of departure. Claire sat on the edge of the chair where she'd spent the night, boots laced, coat zipped. Her hair was damp from melted snow, pushed back behind her ears without care. She wasn't rushing, but there was a steadiness in her movements that hadn't been there before. Not strength exactly, but a refusal to freeze in place. Maya stepped in from the porch, brushing powder from her shoulders. "Plows through," she said simply. "We can roll when you're ready." Claire glanced once at Walt. He nodded, slow and sure. "You've got good people now," he said. No speech, no dramatics, just quiet affirmation. She swallowed against a lump in her throat and answered with a soft, "Thank you." Walt looked away, busy himself with the stove, but she saw his jaw shift, the silent answer of a man, and used the praise, but willing to carry it. Duke trotted over and nudged her leg once, a farewell of sorts, tail giving a lazy half-wag. The deputies helped with nothing more than opening the door and holding it steady against a gust of cold. Claire stepped out into the white world, the air sharp against her cheeks, but it didn't feel hostile anymore. The lane, once a terrifying unknown, was simply a road again, narrow, rutted, leading somewhere. A black and white cruiser idled at the clearing's edge, exhaust curling in steady plumes. Its lights were off now, just a quiet engine waiting. Maya took the driver's seat. Franklin slid behind the wheel of the second car to follow. Claire climbed into the passenger side, quilt tucked under her arm because Walt had insisted she take it. The seat was warm, blessedly so, and the door shut with a dull thump that cut the cold away. She turned once and looked back. The small cabin, lantern swinging gently on its hook, Walt's tall shape framed by the doorway. He lifted a hand in an almost wave, but let it fall before it became one. Then the cruiser began to move. The tires hummed over plowed snow, slow but certain. Claire leaned her head lightly against the glass and watched the world slide past. Fields of white stretched in every direction, broken only by the dark stitch of fences and the occasional rise of trees. The sky was the same dull pewter as the road, horizon and earth blurring into one quiet landscape. It was not relief exactly that she felt, but something looser than fear, the absence of constant bracing. Her body, sore and wrung out, had stopped waiting for the next blow. Maya drove without talking for the first miles, eyes steady on the road. When she finally spoke, it was gentle. "How you holding up?" Claire considered the question. The glass cold against her temple, the quilt heavy across her lap. "Lighter," she said after a long pause. "Not safe yet, but lighter." "That's enough for today," Maya replied. No probing, no false comfort. Just a simple agreement. They drove on in silence. Claire traced the path back with her eyes. The twisted lane, the main road where the tracks had first appeared, the long stretches where she had walked alone under stars she thought might swallow her whole. Seeing it from inside the cruiser felt like stepping out of a nightmare and realized it was made of earth and snow after all. Terrible but ordinary, not infinite. Her phone, dead and useless last night, now lay on the dashboard plugged into the cruiser's charger. A green bar crawled across the screen. Messages would come later, from her sister, maybe from neighbors who'd seen lights. She wasn't ready for them yet, but she didn't feel crushed by the idea either. The radio murmured occasionally with other calls. A car off the shoulder somewhere, a truck needing assistance. Life going on indifferent and steady. Claire let the sound wash over her, strange and comforting. When they reached the first small cluster of town lights, she straightened slightly. Gas station neon buzzed pale against the snow, and a pair of early plow trucks idled by the curb. Civilization felt almost unreal after the long night, but she was glad to see it. She wasn't invisible anymore. Maya glanced at her once more before they turned toward the sheriff's office. "We'll take care of what's next. You'll have time." Claire nodded. "I know." And to her surprise, she meant it. The cruiser rolled to the quiet streets, passing closed shops and drifting smoke from chimneys. Claire kept her eyes on the passing world, each landmark another stitch back into a life she could shape differently. There was no flood of relief waiting for her, but something more honest, a raw unburdening, a space where terror had been. She drew the quilt tighter, breathed in slow and deep, and let herself believe in the road ahead, whatever it would be. For the first time, the return didn't feel like going back. It felt like moving forward. The building was small and square, half brick and half weather-worn siding, its front light glowing against the early gray morning. The cruiser pulled into a space near the entrance and rolled to a stop with a gentle crunch of tires on salt and slush. Claire sat for a moment, breathing in the quiet hum of the heater, gathering herself. Through the windshield she could see steam lifting from the roof vents and a single flag stirring on its pole. Everything so normal it felt almost unreal after the night she had lived. Maya shut the engine off and turned toward her with the same patient calm she had carried all night. "Ready?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. She didn't trust her voice yet, but her body moved. When she stepped out, the cold felt sharp but ordinary again, no longer a predator. Franklin was already by the door, holding it open. Inside, the sheriff's office was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish. A soft murmur of voices came from a back hallway, but the main lobby was quiet except for a dispatcher behind a glass window who gave a nod and a small, knowing smile. A folded stack of fleece blankets waited on a bench. Maya took one without asking and draped it gently over Claire's shoulders. "Sit here for a bit," she said, guiding her toward a chair near a low table stacked with paperwork and mugs. "I'll get tea." The act of sitting surprised Claire with its weight. She sank down slowly, every muscle reminding her the miles she had walked. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the blanket closer, but she wasn't cold, just empty, spent. Walt followed a moment later, brushing melted snow from his boots. He didn't sit, just stood nearby with quiet patience, the brim of his hat low over his eyes. He looked somehow both immense and gentle in this ordinary room. A young deputy she hadn't met, yet brought over a mug of tea, steam curling softly upward. "Here you go, ma'am," he said quietly. "Take your time." She murmured thanks, the words fragile but audible. Maya returned with a small folder and sat beside her. "We'll need to finish a few forms, protective order request, temporary lodging options. Nothing heavy right now, just signatures and basics." Claire nodded and managed to take the pen Maya offered. The papers looked daunting, but were broken into clean, manageable sections. Name, contact, incident location. She wrote slowly, every stroke of ink feeling like both work and relief. Each line seemed to move the story farther away from nightmare and closer to something official, something held by others. When she paused, exhausted, Walt stepped a little closer. She looked up at him, searching for words, but none came easily. He reached out a broad hand, and for a second she didn't know what to do. Then she stood, clutching the blanket with one arm, and took it, His grip was warm and firm, careful not to crush but enough to hold steady. "Glad you knocked," he said simply. Her throat tightened. "Glad you answered." For a man who didn't seem to waste words, he allowed himself a faint smile, brief but real. Then he released her hand and stepped back, shoulders shifting as though shaking off the night. "I'll head back before the road ices again," he said to Maya, then looked at Claire once more. "You'll be all right now." She nodded, unable to say more without tears coming, and he seemed to understand. He tipped his hat slightly and turned toward the door. Duke, waiting obediently by the entry, wagged his tail once and then followed as Walt stepped into the gray morning. The door swung shut with a soft whoosh, letting in a rush of cold air and the smell of pine before closing on him and the long road home. Claire stood still for a long moment, staring at that closed door. She felt the absence of him, of the cabin's quiet strength, but also the echo of what he'd given. Safety, space to stand. It was enough. Maya touched her shoulder lightly, not pulling her back, but anchoring her. "He's a good man," she said. "Yes," Claire whispered. Then, surprising herself with how strong it sounded, "So are you." Maya gave a small nod, accepting the words with quiet grace. "Finish your tea. We'll sort what comes next." Claire sat again, the blanket warm around her and the paperwork waiting, but the weight no longer felt impossible. Through the lobby window, she could see the faint swirl of snow still drifting across the parking lot, and Walt's truck pulling slowly onto the road, taillights disappearing into the pale morning. It wasn't relief, not fully. Too much still waited. Decisions, safety planning, the long work of telling her daughter and building something new. But for the first time in years, she wasn't carrying it alone. She was inside a warm room, name on record, story believed, help tangible. She lifted the mug and let the steam rise against her face, eyes closing briefly. Behind her lids, she could still see the road, the cabin, Walt's lantern in the dark. But now there was this room and tea, and a quiet table where she could sign her own future into being. The world beyond the station's glass had softened into a pale winter morning. Snow still whispered against the windows, tiny flakes dancing sideways on a light wind. But the storm's violence was gone. Inside, the building hummed with low, steady life. Phones ringing somewhere far back, boots on tile, the faint smell of coffee. Claire sat at the end of a long desk beneath a buzzing fluorescent light, the last form before her. Her hands looked different to her now, no longer numb or shaking, just steady, pen balanced easily between her fingers. Maya stood nearby, quiet but attentive, one hip against a file cabinet. She didn't hover, just stayed close enough that Claire felt anchored. Franklin passed occasionally, dropping a nod or a quiet, "You're doing fine," before disappearing into some back office. Each small movement around her was practical and safe, the rhythm of people who did this work often and took it seriously. Claire lowered her eyes to the report. The language was clipped and official. Incident, abandonment, endangerment. But inside those lines was her night, transmuted into something that would hold. She filled in the last empty space with slow, deliberate letters. When she signed her name, the pen glided steady and sure. She didn't rush, didn't shrink it small. Her name belonged on the page. When she set the pen down, her chest tightened, not with panic, but with release. A long breath left her body, uncoiling from somewhere deep in her spine. For a heartbeat, she just sat there, staring at the ink drying, listening to her own breath. Maya took the papers gently, flipped through them with a practiced eye, and then closed the folder. "That's it for now," she said softly. "You've done everything you need to." The words landed heavier than they sounded. Everything she needed to. For so long, she lived in unfinished fear, waiting for the next bruise, the next apology to swallow. Now there was a line drawn, sharp and clean. She had walked away. She had been seen. Her truth was no longer just a memory that could be twisted. "Would you like a ride somewhere safe?" Maya asked, careful not to rush her. Claire thought of her sister's small house on the other side of town, of the spare room that smelled faintly of lavender, of the niece who still kept drawings taped to the walls. She nodded slowly. "Yes, my sister's." "Done," Maya said, already making a quiet note on a pad. Claire stood, Her legs felt sore but strong, heavy from fatigue yet capable. She adjusted the borrowed blanket around her shoulders, then took it off entirely and folded it neatly on the desk. She no longer needed the extra weight. She glanced at the window as she moved, watching snow curl down in lazy spirals. Not threatening, just winter. At the lobby doors, Walt's absence tugged at her. A brief echo of the cabin's warmth and his watchful stillness. But it didn't hollow her. It reminded her she had been carried this far and could walk the rest. She felt gratitude so deep it made her throat ache. But beyond that, she felt something new. Room. Maya opened the outer door and a blade of cold rushed in, sharp and clean. Claire stepped into it willingly. The parking lot stretched wide and white, but the cruiser waiting there felt nothing like the car she had been shoved from. This door she would choose to enter. She paused on the threshold, just long enough to breathe the cold air full and deep. It hurt a little, but it felt real and alive. Behind her, the sheriff's office hummed on, evidence and reports and names filed safely. Ahead was whatever life would be now. Uncertain, probably hard, but hers. Claire exhaled once more, long and even. Then she stepped forward into morning, the sound of snow under her boots steady and sure, free of the car and the road that had tried to erase her.